Cape Town police are reporting the disappearance of a newborn baby from the city's famous Groote Hospital.
Je weet wat jou naam is, wat vrouwen net mooi bring die baba terug, ons sal niks doen nie. Want ze behoort dan hoos.
In the summer of 1997, a young South African couple, Morn and Celeste Nurse, were celebrating the birth of their first child. The joyous occasion, however, turned into a nightmare on April 30th, 1997, when their 3-day-old daughter was kidnapped from the hospital. The brazen act of kidnapping a baby from a maternity ward was unprecedented, but this was the reality that shattered their dreams in an instant. Welcome back to Mysterious 7, where we shed light on under-the-radar cases from across the globe. Today, we'll be looking at a case with the most insane twists you've ever heard. Today, we return to the oldest city in the legislative capital of South Africa, Cape Town. Both Celeste and Morn Nurse had grown up in Mitchell's Plain, which was primarily a non-white township of South Africa just outside Cape Town. The young couple met as teenagers. Morn, masculine and well-built, fell head over heels for Celeste, who was petite and gorgeous. The beginning of 1997 was the inauguration of a new chapter in their lives. On January 4th, 1997, the pair walked down the aisle while expecting their first child with a whirlwind of dreams in their eyes and emotions in their hearts.
At the wedding, I was 6 months already, and people couldn't see anything.
It was so special. Butterflies, suspense, this feeling inside of you, it's, wow, this is the big day.
I have a child, I'm only 19 years old. We were well prepared and we were going all the way. I mean, this is my firstborn and I'm looking forward to every bit of her,
They chose the Groote Hospital, one of the best hospitals in Cape Town, for the surgery. At the end of April that year, Celeste was admitted there for the delivery of her baby. On April 28, 1997, the pair welcomed their long-awaited bundle of joy into the world, a beautiful baby daughter they named Zephany. In Hebrew, that means, the Lord has hidden.
The feeling that I had was, I can't believe this. This is a miracle.
For me, it was such a joy, to be a mom, and I promised myself that I will be a very good mom to her. I had my baby. I was married. My husband was waiting for me, to go home with our baby. Those days was the happiest of my life.
On Wednesday, April 30th, 1997, around 3:30 p.m., still groggy from the morphine masking the pain from the C-section, Celeste spotted a woman sitting in the room near the maternity ward door. The woman was dressed as a nurse in a beige top and maroon pants. The woman asked Celeste if she could pick up Zephany, who was continuously crying while laying on a cot near to her mother's bed. In a medicated haze, Celeste did not sense any danger and assumed that the nurse was trying to help her with the child. She assented and watched the woman pick up and cradle her daughter before drifting back to sleep. She woke up to the frantic voice of a nurse half an hour later. When Celeste sleepily inquired about the other woman she'd seen, the nurse told her that no such woman worked as a nurse in the hospital. Celeste's world came crashing down as she realized Zephany was gone. With despair in her heart, Celeste tore off the IV channels from her arm and began running through the hospital's halls. Even her fresh surgical wounds couldn't stop her from desperately searching for her missing baby. On that very day in the afternoon, around 4:30 p.m., he got a dreadful call. In a state of shock and disbelief, Morn rushed out and frantically drove to the hospital. Upon realizing that something was terribly wrong, the 19-year-old father broke down and sobbed.
The main image that remained, that broke me, was when I saw Celeste sitting there, crying, pushing people away from her.
The police searched the entire hospital from top to bottom, but there was simply no sign of Zephany or the woman. They questioned the hospital staff whether they'd seen anything, but unfortunately, no clues turned up until a bone-chilling story came to light. Shireen Pete was a patient at the same hospital and gave birth on the same day as Celeste. She described a disturbingly close call with her own newborn. While making a phone call at a booth in the hospital corridor, Pete spotted a woman holding her baby. In anger, she yelled at this woman, demanding that she put the baby down. The lady gave the baby back to her and disappeared without a word. Shireen was confident that this was the same woman that kidnapped baby Zephany. She even helped the authorities in creating a sketch of the alleged baby snatcher. From her statements, the South African Police Service determined that Zephany Nurse had likely been kidnapped. However, they still had 1,000 unanswered questions on their minds, the most important of them being how the kidnapper gained access inside the hospital and left with the baby without being noticed. However, there were some clues left behind to follow this trail. A handbag with no hint about its owner and a pillow were abandoned in a disused tunnel-like corridor leading from the outside directly into the maternity ward. As it turned out, the corridor made it easier for women in labor to reach the maternity ward. Investigators believe that the woman had faked the pregnancy with the pillow and entered the maternity ward, then changed into the nurse's uniform, took the baby, and then fled the hospital using the same tunnel while discarding the pillow on her way. What was even more frustrating was that, in 1997, many hospitals in South Africa did not have security cameras, and this hospital was no exception. So, despite having a sketch and the discarded pillow as evidence, authorities simply did not have any leads on the missing baby and her abductor. Celeste and Morn were enraged by this outcome, but sadly, the anger couldn't subside the agony of their child being stolen. 2 days later, they came home empty-handed, struggling to accept the fact that their precious child, whom they'd been eagerly anticipating bringing home, had been snatched away. On one side, they were desperately longing for Zephany's safe return, but on the other, fear gripped their hearts as they contemplated the potential harm or danger their baby might be facing.
Al die waren frases, je weet wat jouw naam is, but vrouwen niet mooi, breng je baba terug, we zal niks te jou nie. En hoe zit hij kind lief? Want ze behoort een hoes.
In the beginning, both Celeste and Morn blamed themselves for this tragedy. While Celeste felt guilty that she'd fallen asleep, Morn was angry he'd not been there when his daughter needed him. Their hope of finding Zephany was renewed for a brief period when police investigated a woman whose neighbors had never seen pregnant, but suddenly had a baby.
They said this woman's child was about a couple of weeks, and this woman gave birth at Groote Skeer as well. I pulled up and said, yes, we're going to find her today, we're going to find her today.
Picture yourself walking into this house, knowing, look, there is life. You can hear this child crying in the background. Wow. You just tell yourself, this is my child, this is my child.
And when we got there, it was actually a boy.
The nurses' hearts were broken once again. Despite the pain and heartbreak, the parents were not ready to give up on Zephany. While still dealing with their grief, they appeared on several news channels pleading with the abductor to return their child. The case garnered widespread national attention, with the media taking interest in this strange case of abduction. Missing posters of the baby were also distributed by the authorities, but weeks turned into months, and months turned into years with no sign of Zephany. In that time, Celeste and Morn did not stop searching for their daughter. They kept in touch with the investigators to keep the search alive, but there were still no leads. In the years that followed, the Nurse family kept hoping that someone, somewhere, was taking care of Zephany.
For 4 years, the hope of getting Zephany back made us forget we can have our own kids.
Celeste and Morn even celebrated Zephany's birthday each year by hosting a party, blowing out an ever-growing number of candles, and handing out goodie bags to local children. Sadly, the birthday girl remained absent. Celeste and Morn did their best to keep the case in the public eye, often making public appeals in newspapers or on television, begging the kidnapper to return the girl. They always hoped that it would jog someone's memory, possibly creating a new lead. Sadly, years of mourning the absence of their child and battling to keep the hope alive caused turmoil in their relationship. Beneath the weight of their sorrow, they struggled as a married couple. Finally, they decided to bring another child into their family. In 2001, 4 years after Zephany's kidnapping, the birth of another daughter sparked the renewal of their family dream. Their second child was named Cassidy. Morn doted on his baby girl, bestowing her with the love he'd never had the chance to offer Zephany. Celeste's mind, on the other hand, was overwhelmed by fear. On many occasions, she'd attach Cassidy's wrist to hers with a band while the baby was lying next to her, and then cover her with a blanket in an attempt to hide her. Although Cassidy lit up their lives, the struggle between Celeste and Morn continued. The nurses told Cassidy about her stolen older sister when she was 3 years old, and after that, never stopped talking about her. Cassidy, who even looked like Zephany, grew up believing that she was the replacement child her parents had as a substitute for their missing firstborn. At times, she even questioned her parents' love for her. Though she never complained to Celeste and Morn, she dwindled on the thought of whether their love was actually meant for her, or if it was supposed to be for her missing sister.
As I grew up, they told me every day about her, every day. It was always about the sister. Wherever I go, you know what happened to your sister, you can't go there. It was just Zephany, Zephany, Zephany. And I would say, but I'm not Zephany.
Her sister's disappearance had impacted her life in other ways too. Cassidy was not allowed to play with her friends outside, go out to the movies or shopping, even for a short period of time. She was frustrated with the way her life was, but she always complied.
I couldn't play with my friends. I couldn't go out to the movies. I can't even go to the shop for 5 minutes. My father screaming, yelling like a mad person. Where are you? Why are you taking so long? Going berserk. I felt like I was the other Zephany that was just being there, being kept there to take that pain away. That's how I felt.
A glimmer of hope ignited within the hearts of Celeste and Morn when, at 3 a.m. on July 17, 2009, 12 years after the abduction, a strange phone call came in. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to a woman. In a whispered voice, the woman claimed that she knew about Zephany and demanded 500,000 South African rand, ZAR, equivalent to approximately $33,000, in exchange for information regarding Zephany's location. She also instructed the couple to bring the cash to a KFC restaurant in Mitchell's Plain. The nurses called the police and showed up at the fast food restaurant wearing wires and with the bag containing the money, but no one arrived to pick it up. An investigation ensued, and authorities were able to track down the caller. Shockingly, the woman was identified as Glenda Dubell, a neighbor of Celeste's mother. She heard about Zephany's abduction on the news and hatched a plan to extort money. She was ultimately sentenced to 3 years of house arrest. For Celeste and Morn, the disappointment was nothing new, but their relentless pursuit to bring their child back home had taken its toll, straining their relationship to the breaking point.
I blamed Morning. I told him, you were not there for us. I said, you were supposed to be there with me when I gave birth. You were supposed to watch the baby while I sleep. We blame one another.
We went on, it went on, blaming year after year. It was like, I still can't believe,
After they made the difficult decision to separate in 2015, both of them started seeing other people, with Morn even fathering a child with another woman, and Celeste getting engaged to another man. Their children moved in with their mother. Despite this separation, the flames of hope continued to flicker in their hearts, and they still longed for the day when their family would finally be whole again. In the same year, Celeste was dealt another blow, having been diagnosed with stage 3B cervical cancer. Despite her illness, she was raising her 3 kids on her own.
Doctors said the tumor is as big as a golf ball and that you have cervical cancer stage 3B. And I told myself, I'm going to die. Who's going to take care of my kids? And I've got nobody to support me besides my mom. I need my husband. He's not there. And everything, I just broke down completely.
All in all, this was a year that brought trouble upon trouble for the family. But unbeknownst to them, the year would also bring an unimaginable twist into their lives. In January 2015, Celeste and Morn's 13-year-old daughter Cassidy joined Zwanswick High School in the southern suburbs outside Cape Town, which had more than 1,000 pupils. On her first day of school, a bizarre incident occurred. Several students told Cassidy about her uncanny resemblance to a final year student, 17-year-old Misha Solomon. The whispers at school did not take long to reach Misha's ears too. When Cassidy and Misha finally met each other through the persuasion of their schoolmates, they couldn't believe their eyes. With light brown skin, a broad nose, almond-shaped eyes, and ample lips, the girls were the spitting image of each other. Not only did they feel like they looked alike, both Cassidy and Misha felt an instant connection with each other.
The short girl, she told me, you know, there's this girl. You look exactly like her. My English teacher. He also told me that, he said, you know, you look like this girl. And I'm thinking to myself, if a teacher can tell me, then I know something is up. And the bell rang for interval. And as I walked out, we bumped into each other. And I looked at her, and she looked at me. And everybody around us was being rowdy, and they looked like each other. This is the two.
Despite the 4-year age gap between the two girls, they became fast friends and began to spend a lot of time together. While Cassidy addressed Misha as Big Sis, Misha called her Baby Girl. They presumed their being lookalikes of each other was nothing more than mere coincidence. They couldn't have foreseen the twists and turns that lay ahead. When Misha and Cassidy snapped a selfie together to show off their resemblance, it was just for fun. Little did they know that selfie would alter their lives forever. When friends saw the picture, they were curious to know if Misha was adopted. Without any hesitation in her mind, the 17-year-old girl insisted that nothing of that sort had happened. As Misha showed the pictures to her parents, her mother Lavona Solomon also commented on the stark resemblance between them. Her father, Michael Solomon, however, recognized her daughter's new friend. He often visited the electrical store Morn owned. The story would have ended there if Cassidy also excitedly didn't show the pictures to her parents. Celeste and Morn were stunned to see the picture.
It was beautiful. It's a moment that you can't really explain because there's too much joy. It was way too much joy, you know.
As they gazed intensely at the photograph, a surge of hope washed over them. Could this be their missing daughter, Zephany? Or was it another dead end? They didn't yet know what the truth was, but as always, they were determined to pursue any lead that could bring them their daughter back home. So they had one question for Misha. The next time Cassidy met Misha, everything changed. The former asked the latter what her birthday was. As it turned out, Misha's birthday was on April 30th, 1997, the exact same day when Zephany was abducted from the hospital. With this information, the nurse family contacted Mike Barkhuizen, the lead detective who's in charge of Zephany's abduction case. Just weeks later, Misha's math lesson was interrupted as she was summoned to the principal's cabin in the school. 2 social workers were waiting there to tell her Zephany's story. Although Misha listened intently to the story, she was unsure about the part she played there. The social workers suggested that they had enough evidence to believe that she could be the missing child, but Misha refused to believe this.
And then she took out this file and she showed me the records of babies that were born on the 30th of April. And she asked me where I was born. And I told her, well, from what I know, my mom told me I was born at Retreat Hospital. And she showed me records of Retreat Hospital on that day, in that year. There's no Misha Solomon at that hospital.
To make matters straight, Misha assured them that according to her birth certificate, she had been born in the Retreat Hospital, which is a 20-minute drive away from the Groot Shore Hospital, the very place from where baby Zephany had vanished. To her surprise, Misha was informed that there was no record of her being born in that hospital. In an attempt to be sure once and for all, the officials requested a DNA test from her.
They convinced me to take the DNA test, but in my mind it was made up that.
Misha wholeheartedly believed that Lavona and Michael were her biological parents, so she agreed to take a DNA test. With never a doubt in her mind, she believed that her mother would never lie to her about who she was and where she came from.
This is not true. My mom is my mom, my dad is my dad. I am Shay. I had no doubt that this was a lie or something like that, because that's how much I believe in my mom.
So she was confident that the result would come back as negative. But things didn't go as planned. After 6 excruciating weeks of testing, the results came back in late February 2015, ending all the disputes. Misha Solomon was indeed Zephany nurse. Much to their delight, after over 15 years, Celeste and Morn had finally found their daughter. After the results came back, Detective Barkhuizen and his team leapt into the investigation in the Solomon home located at Lavender Hill in Cape Town.
12 o'clock on the 25th of February 2015, I got that call.
There was a 99.96% chance that Michelle was definitely the daughter of Mornay and Celeste Nurse.
Is it Celeste? And I said, yes. Sit jy op 'n stoel? Ek sê, nee, ek staan. Celeste, jy gaan weer mamma word. And the phone fell out of my hand. I cried. I just burst into tears. I cried. I couldn't stop crying. I didn't know, my whole world, everything just changed. I was happy and I was sad at the same time.
During interrogation, Michael Solomon told the investigators that he never, for once, suspected that Misha was not his daughter. He was very distraught at the revelations and still considered Misha his only daughter. The same, however, could not be said about Lavona Solomon. Although Lavona denied any wrongdoing, investigators believed that she either had a miscarriage or she faked the pregnancy to her husband. Then, on the fateful day of April 30th, 1997, she abducted 3-day-old Zephany from her mother's side and pretended that she'd given birth to the infant herself.
I was just stumped. I didn't know what to say. How could it be this is my daughter? This couldn't be the missing child that they're looking for.
Despite her protest, the investigators did not believe that Lavona was innocent. She was eventually charged with kidnapping, fraud, and violating the Children's Act and was taken into custody. Zephany's case captivated the attention of South Africa and made headlines across the nation over a staggering 17 years. But when it was finally solved, Misha, as she preferred to be called, was just entering adulthood, struggling to make sense of her life. Following Lavona's arrest, she was removed from the Solomon home and was placed with social services, while Celeste and Morn got visitation rights. For Misha, her life was turned upside down before she could even flinch. The trauma of finding out that the only parents she knew over the 17 years of her life were not related to her, and her mother was now behind bars, was incomprehensible. To Misha, Lavona was an incredibly loving mother who gave her an amazing childhood, fulfilling her every wish. It crushed her to see how she was being treated like a criminal and how, in her absence, the family was falling apart. In the Nurse family household, however, the picture was strikingly different. Celeste and Morn had been divorced at the time, but when news rippled through South Africa that their daughter had been found, the parents put on a united front, arriving at press briefings together, holding hands. They could not believe that while they were desperately searching for their daughter, she was growing up just 3 miles away from them under a different identity. For them, years of pain, anger, and frustration were replaced by hope, joy, and delight.
I still can't believe it though. Yeah.
It's still so overwhelming. It's like, shoo.
It's
We're still
unbelievable.
dreaming. It's like after 17 and a half years, she's back. It's like,
She addresses Celeste as mommy, and she addresses me as daddy. And she can't believe she got such a young mommy.
On February 26, 2015, Celeste and Morn finally came face to face with their long-lost daughter. Their hearts pounded with a mix of anticipation and trepidation as they embraced Misha, sobbing, with no intention of letting her go again. Unfortunately, Misha did not share the same sentiment. Although she tried to understand how hard it had been for her parents, they were basically strangers to her. The dilemma caused her further emotional turmoil. For the first few weeks, Misha spent time with her 3 siblings and her biological parents, trying to get to know them better. The nurses were blissfully happy. Celeste also shared some special moments with her firstborn as they started the preparations for Misha's high school graduation dance. It was a constant struggle for the parents to hold back their tears. But Misha, on the other hand, felt like she was betraying the Solomon family by spending time with the nurses. Cracks in the relationship began to appear ahead of Misha's 18th birthday. To mark this as the first year where their daughter would be present to blow out her own candles, Celeste and Morn planned a big celebration. They even hired a venue, invited their closest friends, and ordered a cake. Unfortunately, the birthday girl would not be present at this time either. Misha spent her milestone birthday with the Solomon family in the home where she grew up. The relationship was further strained when Misha moved in with her adoptive father, Michael, after turning 18. She initially considered moving in with one of her biological parents, but ultimately decided against it due to the messy living situation of her separated parents. Michael, for her, was the obvious choice, a safe home. Despite awful allegations against her, both Michael and Misha stood by Lavona's side. Lavona had already pleaded not guilty, and throughout the trial, she denied stealing baby Zephany. In a 35-page plea explanation, Lavona declared herself an unfortunate victim of a cunning woman, the real kidnapper, according to her words. She started her story by going backwards in time. She claimed that throughout childhood and adulthood, she'd been abused by different men in her life. She also said that she suffered a series of miscarriages as a result of the severe beatings from her boyfriend. She admitted to faking her pregnancy for 4 months after she suffered a miscarriage in 1997. She hid the news from her husband and approached a middle-aged woman, Sylvia, for fertility treatments. Lavona further told the court that instead of treatments, Sylvia offered to help her adopt a child. Behind Michael's back, Lavona had secretly made arrangements to adopt a baby in exchange for 3,000 rand, equivalent to approximately $265. Sylvia handed Lavona an infant wrapped in a blanket at a Cape Town bus station on April 30th, 1997. Lavona also claimed that Sylvia told her that the baby's mother was a young girl who wanted to give up her child for adoption, and the documentation would be sorted out later. Lavona said despite a bad feeling, she brought the little girl home. Lavona further insisted that on many occasions, she intended to tell Michael and Misha about the adoption, but never managed to muster up the courage. The prosecution deemed this story too far-fetched. There was no evidence that Sylvia even existed. But that was not the only card they had up their sleeve. In a final twist to the story, they brought their star witness, Shireen Pete, who had picked Lavona out of a lineup as the woman she caught cradling her baby on the day Zephany was stolen. Shireen's testimony ultimately sealed Lavona's fate. On August 15, 2016, Lavona was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison for the kidnapping. The judge concluded that the evidence against her was overwhelming, and she did not even feel remorse for her actions. She was ultimately sentenced to 10 years of prison, despite Misha's pleas for leniency. She'll be eligible for parole in July 2023.
Ek voel ecstatic. I feel good because justice will prevail was our first say. Ons het gehuil vir 18 jaar. Hulle huil daar binne, laat hulle huil.
Zephany is back. We just got to work on it, how to get her back to us. But I love her, and I do love her with all my heart.
By the end of 2015, Misha's relationship turned sour with her biological family. Unable to handle the emotional tug-of-war between two families, Misha made it clear she loved the woman who had raised her, even though she was her abductor. She regularly visited Lavona in prison, and she also kept a close bond with Michael and his family. Morn and Celeste tried to take a step back to provide her enough time to heal, but they could not help but feel robbed of the opportunity of sharing a life with their precious daughter. The relationship was further strained when, in 2019, Misha published a book with writer Joanne Jowell titled Zephany, Two Mothers, One Daughter, an astonishing true story. In the book, she documented what it was like to discover the truth about her identity and her struggle to build a relationship with her biological parents. She even addressed Celeste as immature and Morn as a lost cause. This sparked conflicts between them, and before long, Misha cut off all contact with her biological family. By 2019, at the age of 22, Misha was a single mother of 2 children. At this point, she stopped visiting Lavona in prison, as it was difficult for her to make the long journey with her children. During one of her last visits, in an effort to gain closure, Misha insisted Lavona tell her the truth, but she declined. Despite everything, Misha forgave her. Incredibly, Celeste chose not to hold a grudge against Lavona, even though the woman had stolen her baby from her, causing her years of agony. She said that she was happy that her daughter turned out to be a beautiful person inside out, and so she was ready to forgive Lavona. Fortunately, things changed for the better between Misha and the nurse family during the COVID-19 lockdown. In November 2020, Celeste and Morn remarried, and all 4 of their children witnessed the precious moment. Misha, with her 2 children, moved in with her parents and her younger siblings. It was the first time Celeste and Morn could have a genuine bond with Misha. The family that was torn apart has been complete ever since. On September 12, 2009, the lifeless body of William Edwin Bill Sparkman Jr., a 51-year-old census worker and school teacher, was discovered in a desolate cemetery within the haunting depths of the Appalachian region of Kentucky. Suspended eerily from a tree, stripped of all dignity and with his hands bound, a chilling message adorned his chest, the word "fed." As investigators began to look into the perplexing case, what was unraveled left them and the entire community utterly astounded. So, who had taken Bill's life? What secrets lay concealed within the shadows of this unsettling mystery? Tucked away in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains lies Clay County, Kentucky. With a population of around 20,000, this hidden gem beckons adventurers and history enthusiasts alike, offering an unforgettable experience. Clay County boasts mesmerizing hiking trails, including the enchanting Redbird Crest Trail that weaves through dense forests. And it was here a perplexing crime occurred. But first, let's go to Mulberry, Florida, where it all began. William Edwin Sparkman Jr., known fondly as Bill, was born on August 12, 1958, in the city of Mulberry, Florida. Bill was the eldest of 3 sons. His brothers' names were Thomas and Jonathan Sparkman. His father, William Sparkman Sr., was an executive at a large furniture chain. His mother, Henry, was a high school principal. With each passing year, Bill's life's narrative became a symphony of ambition and brilliance, infused with the love and wisdom bestowed upon him by his parents. During his childhood, he had an important role as an altar boy, serving in the church and finding a sense of purpose in his faith. As he grew older and attended Mulberry High School, Bill's passion for sports and writing took center stage. He became a sports editor for the local newspaper, the Mulberry Press, where he shared exciting stories about games and athletes. But his involvement didn't stop there. Bill also learned photography to capture thrilling sports moments and even delivered newspapers around town. Bill's hunger for knowledge was insatiable, and he didn't shy away from academic challenges. In high school, he even took calculus courses at Florida Southern College. After graduating from high school, he moved on to Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, where he became a manager for the football team. But as fate would have it, he felt a strong pull back to his home state, Florida, where he continued his college journey at the University of South Florida. As Bill ventured into adulthood, he found himself drawn to the wonders of Boy Scout camp, With his prestigious rank as an Eagle Scout, he spent time immersed in the beauty of nature and guiding young scouts. For 3 summers, he shared his knowledge as the ecology director, teaching children about the environment and its secrets. Then, for 2 more summers, he took charge as the program director. Bill's path then led him to the vibrant city of Atlanta, Georgia. There, he continued to dedicate himself to scouting and touching the lives of those around him. However, in 1993, the winds of change blew once again, carrying him to London, Kentucky. It was within this land that he made a profound decision, opening his heart and home to a precious gift from above. He adopted a baby boy whom he named Josh, and together they formed an unbreakable bond as father and son. In Kentucky, Bill also found fulfillment by volunteering at a school named Johnson Elementary. The experience was so rewarding that it sparked a deep interest in pursuing a career in education. Eventually, he was offered a position as an instructional assistant at the school. Embracing this new chapter with open arms, Bill embarked on a remarkable journey that would span 9 extraordinary years. Within the corridors of the school, he became a guiding light for students, a source of inspiration and support. In the year 2003, Bill got a part-time job with the United States Census Bureau, where he was involved in data collection and analysis. 2 years later, in 2005, he took another significant step. He enrolled in an online college called Western Governors University to pursue a bachelor's degree. With unwavering determination, he dedicated around 20 hours per week to his studies. Day by day, he moved closer to his dream of earning a bachelor's degree. However, in September 2007, Bill's world was unexpectedly cast into shadow. He noticed a strange cyst on the side of his neck. Concerned, he decided to see a doctor. The news was unexpected. He was diagnosed with stage 3 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is a type of cancer that begins in the lymphatic system. The reality of it all shook Bill to the core, but he refused to let it break his spirit. Treatment began immediately with him undergoing chemotherapy. During this challenging time, Bill's colleagues at Johnson Elementary rallied round him. They stood by his side, offering emotional support and thoughtful gifts. Despite his illness, Bill continued working diligently. By the end of December 2007, he managed to complete his academic coursework. Upon achieving this feat, Bill's university extended a remarkable invitation. They requested his presence at the graduation ceremony in Salt Lake City, not as a mere attendee, but as the esteemed keynote speaker. He agreed and made the trip. Standing at the podium in front of 600 fellow students, his words flowed with passion as he spoke of resilience, perseverance, and the transformative power of education. As he finished speaking, the audience erupted into applause, recognizing the impact of his words. Bill stood tall, a symbol of triumph and inspiration. In 2008, Bill proudly received his degree and took on substitute teaching positions in Laurel County while seeking a permanent role as a middle school math teacher. Alongside his teaching pursuits, he also remained committed to his work with the United States Census Bureau and devoted time to after-school programs. However, things would soon take a dark turn. On Thursday, September 10, 2009, Bill's absence at Johnson Elementary sparked concern among his colleagues, including Gilbert Asiardo, a director at the school. Worry crept into their hearts as they wondered where Bill could be. Asiardo and the others couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong, as Bill would never miss work without informing them first. At that time, Bill lived alone with his dog named Jack. His son, Josh, who was now 19 years old, resided with friends in Tennessee and was navigating his own path in life. Asiardo and some of Bill's colleagues decided to pay a visit to his home to see what was wrong with him. They went late at night when he would normally be there. "We know him and we know his habits, and we know if he should be at home or not," Asiardo said. However, upon their arrival at Bill's home, an eerie silence greeted them. They found Jack, Bill's faithful dog, but there was no sign of Bill himself. Worry intensified among his colleagues. Without hesitation, Asiardo contacted the police, urging them to start an investigation into Bill's whereabouts and well-being. The weight of uncertainty hung heavy in the air, and everyone yearned for answers. On September 12, 2009, a group of relatives ventured to the Hoskins Cemetery in rural Clay County, Kentucky, to pay their respects to their departed loved ones. Amidst the serenity of the surrounding woods, an unsettling sight awaited them. As they drove past a clearing not too far from the cemetery, they noticed a naked figure tied tightly to a tree. The man's vulnerable state sent shivers down their spines, his only clothing consisting of socks that barely shielded his feet from the forest floor. A rope hung around his neck, connected to a tree. The scene grew even more sinister as the onlookers observed the man's mouth, eyes, hands, and feet bound by layers of duct tape. His body also bore a haunting message scrawled upon his chest. The word "fed," marked upside down as if to symbolize a twisted mockery of justice. Without hesitation, the witnesses dialed emergency services, urgently pleading for help. The news of the grotesque scene spread like wildfire, summoning law enforcement officers to the haunting sight. Soon, the lifeless naked man was identified as none other than Bill, who had gone missing a few days earlier. As the officers searched the crime scene, they discovered Bill's truck nearby. The tailgate was down. This led officers to believe that Bill's life might have been taken somewhere else, and he was then brought to the spot where he was displayed by being hung up. The discovery of Bill in such a cruel and bizarre state sent shockwaves through the town. People couldn't help but wonder who was responsible for his untimely demise. The timing of his death was also troubling because there was already heightened concern about violence against the government. The fact that a census worker in rural Kentucky could be the victim of a sinister murder plot by anti-government individuals set off alarms in Washington. The incident made the government worried that anger and dissatisfaction towards Washington might be turning into extremism, even domestic terrorism, with government representatives as potential targets. The news of Bill's tragic death prompted a swift and determined response from those in power. Office of Personnel Management Director John Barry didn't mince words when he issued a stern warning saying, "We will come down on these perpetrators as hell hath no fury." As the media spotlight continued to shine upon the unfolding events, both the FBI and Washington pledged to pursue the investigation with utmost vigor. Amidst the confusion and uncertainty, another troubling possibility emerged regarding Bill's fate. The theory suggested that he had unknowingly crossed paths with the dangerous world of the mountain trade. Interestingly, around the time of the incident, law enforcement had been busy apprehending over 40 drug dealers in the area where Bill was working. This raised concerns that he may have unintentionally stumbled upon something dangerous. Asiardo, Bill's colleague at the elementary school, revealed that he'd warned Bill to be cautious in certain rural areas while conducting his census work. Following all these revelations, the investigation gained urgency as authorities sought to uncover the truth behind Bill's death. The goal extended beyond seeking justice. It was also about protecting others from the dangers that lurked beneath the surface. The entire nation continued to watch attentively, awaiting the outcome of a relentless quest for answers. On October 6, 2009 was the day Bill's body was returned to his grieving family. A mix of relief and frustration filled the air as the state medical examiner's office admitted that they had only managed to determine the cause of his death, which was asphyxiation and strangulation. But the sequence of events leading to his death remained a puzzle that continued to baffle investigators. On October 11, 2009, Regional Director Wayne Hatcher of the Census Bureau's Charlotte office conducted a memorial service for Bill. The cemetery in Clay County served as the backdrop for the solemn gathering, where the weight of loss hung heavy in the air. During the memorial service, Director Hatcher shared a disheartening revelation. And this was that the news of Bill's untimely death had shaken the very core of the Census Bureau, and it had prompted other employees to seek safety in numbers. Fear and uncertainty had gripped their hearts, leading to requests for team-based operations during census gatherings. At some point, the United States Census Bureau made the difficult decision to ultimately suspend its operations in Clay County, ensuring that no one else would fall victim to the unknown dangers that lurked within the community. Finally, a glimmer of hope appeared in late October as reports circulated that the resolution of the case was close. However, caution prevailed, with the authorities refusing to rush their conclusions. Every step was taken with meticulous care, aware that one misstep could obscure the clarity they sought. November 24, 2009 arrived with shocking revelations that left everyone bewildered. Investigators, in a stunning turn of events, declared that Bill's death was not a result of foul play, but rather a tragic act of taking one's own life. The truth unraveled like a complex web, leaving the community in disbelief. According to their findings, Bill had orchestrated the scheme to commit insurance fraud. They suspected that Bill, burdened by the weight of his battle with cancer, had meticulously planned his own demise because he believed it to be the financial solution for his struggling son. Reports suggested that Bill had obtained life insurance policies totaling a staggering $600,000 shortly before his death. However, Bill's plan held a loophole. The policies would not pay out in the case of death caused by cancer, the very affliction he was faced with. One significant detail that fueled investigators' belief that Bill had orchestrated his own demise was the peculiar inscription found on his chest, the letters FED written upside down. The orientation of the letters raised suspicions that Bill had written them himself. Furthermore, the way Bill was found, with a rope around his neck but his feet touching the ground, suggested that he could alleviate the pressure on his neck and potentially avoid a fatal outcome. The realization that he could have stood up and relieved the strain deepened the conviction that he had deliberately chosen his path. According to the intrigue, the police revealed the existence of an unidentified witness who shared crucial information. According to this witness, Bill had expressed thoughts of ending his own life and frequently spoke about the negative attitudes towards federal entities within the Clay County community. It seemed like he wanted to use these fears and suspicions to make it look like he was a victim of anti-government sentiment. Investigators believed that this insight into his mindset provided a glimpse into the inner turmoil he was experiencing. The sheer audacity and complexity of Bill's scheme left everyone astounded. It was a tale of desperation, financial hardship, and a desperate attempt to secure a future for his loved ones. The community was left grappling to reconcile the image of a dedicated and respected individual with what had now been laid bare by the authorities. But Bill's family strongly disagreed with the investigators' conclusion. Henry Sparkman, Bill's mother, even sent an email to the media in which she expressed her disagreement. Close friends of Bill also came forward, expressing their disbelief and asserting that he had shown no signs or hints of contemplating taking his own life. They found the idea hard to accept, as it contradicted everything they knew about him. Josh, Bill's son, also expressed his deep frustration with the investigators' conclusion regarding his father's death. In a heartfelt statement to the media, he found their conclusion disrespectful and disagreed with their assessment. Josh passionately described his father as a good man, emphasizing that someone who had fought cancer with unwavering determination would not choose to end his own life. As the days passed, Josh remained resolute in his belief that his father's death was a homicide. He pointed out that his father's truck had been ransacked with valuable items stolen, including Sparkman's census laptop and a precious family wedding ring. These details only strengthened Josh's conviction that foul play was involved. The case of Bill remains a puzzling and haunting mystery, with conflicting perspectives and unanswered questions. Despite the official conclusion, which points to Bill taking his own life, there are those who vehemently dispute the finding, including Bill's own family and friends. Their unwavering belief in his character and the circumstances surrounding his death challenges the established narrative. As we continue to contemplate, one question lingers in the air. What truly happened to Bill on that fateful day? Was it a tragic act of desperation, as investigators concluded? Or was there a more sinister plot at play? Sunday, July 11th, 2004, was not an easy day for 16-year-old Brittney Gregory. Her relationship with her 18-year-old boyfriend, John Fitzgerald, had been going through a rough patch lately. She spent the afternoon sleeping and watching TV, trying to distract herself, but it didn't help for very long. In the evening, Brittney had an intense argument with John over the phone. Frustrated and worried about her relationship, she finally gave in and decided to make up with John. That same evening, Brittney left to go meet John, but sadly, she never returned home. What could have happened to Brittney? Was she ever going to return home? Brick Township is a township situated on the Jersey Shore within Ocean County in the U.S. state of New Jersey. It's one of the biggest townships among the ones the Jersey Shore harbors. Residents here often enjoy their weekends hanging out at the parks and beaches the town offers. Brick Township is a delight to the eyes because of its scenic terrain. It's also a huge attraction for the tourists who usually rent a bike here and take in the town's beauty. Brick Township has a population of over 75,000 people. In 2003 and 2004, Brick Township was ranked as the second safest city in the United States after Newton, Massachusetts. But contradictorily, Brick Township also became the place where Brittney met her tragic end in 2004. Brittney Mae Gregory was born on April 1, 1988, in the town of Brick Township, Ocean County, New Jersey. Initially, she lived with her parents, Deborah Gregory and Joe Dunn, but when Brittney was only a toddler, her parents decided to separate. From then onwards, she split her time between both of them as they shared custody of her. Brittney had a total of 4 siblings. She was the youngest amongst all of them and shared a special bond with each of them. Barbara Jo Dunn was her biological older sister. She and Brittney had an age gap of 3 years. Apart from Barbara, there was Brianna, William, and Brian Gregory, who were Brittney's half-siblings from her mother's side. By 2004, Brittney had grown up to be a clever and intelligent 16-year-old teenager. She had a set of blue eyes with her blonde hair hovering above them. There was always a smile on her face. Brittney loved going to school. She was a junior at Brick Memorial High School. As Brittney was an excellent student, her teachers had high hopes for her future. Brittney had a dream of studying crime scene evidence and becoming a forensic scientist so she could help solve crimes. When it came to TV shows, Brittney couldn't have enough of the ones on forensic crimes. And like any other teenager, Brittney had a keen interest in music as well. She idolized pop star Britney Spears and had stacks of her posters in her room. At the time in 2004, Brittney was also in a steady relationship with her 18-year-old boyfriend, John Fitzgerald. They'd met 2 years ago in 2002 at school. Those who knew Brittney described her as an easygoing girl who, even at the age of just 16 years, was quite mature for her age. Being the youngest one in her house, she was well loved and pampered by her family, friends, community, as well as her boyfriend John. According to Deborah, Brittney's mother, Brittney was spoiled by her family, but she was never vain or arrogant. On Sunday, July the 11th, 2004, 16-year-old Brittney was having a rough day. She and her boyfriend, 18-year-old John Fitzgerald, had been fighting a lot recently. It had started 2 days ago on the 9th when Brittney found out that John had been hanging out with another girl recently. Brittney had been dating John for almost 2 years now, and she was bothered by the fact that John was pulling away. Brittney was upset, and her mind was occupied with unpleasant thoughts. Brittney had gone to the hospital the previous day, on July 10, 2004, to visit her brother Brian's girlfriend, who had just had a baby. She returned home around 2 a.m. on Sunday, July 11, 2004, and went to sleep straight away. She woke up groggy around noon. Brittney's 19-year-old half-sister, Brianna, noticed that Brittney was not in her best mood. To keep her from thinking about John, Brianna asked Brittney if she'd like to go visit their older brother William, who was in a state prison at the time, awaiting trial on charges that he'd robbed a man after beating him with a tire iron. But Brittney didn't want to go and declined Brianna's offer. Brittney wanted to stay home and sleep. She also wanted to figure out what was going on with John. She finally gave up and called John over the phone. John told her that he was going to hang out at Point Pleasant Beach. Brittney wanted to go as well and asked John if he'd pick her up on the way. John refused, and Brittney hung up the call in frustration. That same evening, Brianna had gone to her brother Bryant's house to babysit his kids, while Brittney was at her father, Mr. Dunn's place. Around 6:30 p.m., Brianna called Brittney to see how she was doing. Brittney told her that she'd been looking for a ride to go over to John's place. She wanted to meet him and sort things out. Brittney asked Brianna not to worry about her and to stay with the kids. She hung up, saying that she'd be back in a couple of hours. That Sunday night, Brittney did leave the house to go see John, but never came back home. The next day, on July 12, 2004, Brittney's father, Mr. Dunn, got worried when he couldn't find Brittney anywhere. He called up Brianna to ask if Brittney was with her or if she knew anything about where she could be. This made Brianna concerned as well, and she immediately went over to John's house and asked him if he'd met Brittney last night. John told her that she never came to visit him. On Monday, July 12, 2004, Brianna went to the local police station in Brick Township in the afternoon and reported her sister missing. That same day, by 4 p.m., detectives Mark Byrne and Elliot Morgan took charge of the case. The detectives arrived at Mr. Dunn's house, as that was the last place Brittney had been seen before she left. They started by questioning Brittney's family and her neighbors, but nobody could recall seeing her that previous night. After a thorough interrogation, the detectives ruled out the possibility of someone close to Brittney being involved in her disappearance. The detectives searched Brittney's house and found her cell phone, makeup, and her diary. To the detectives, Brittney's disappearance was starting to look more and more like an abduction. Brianna told the investigators about Brittney and John's bumpy relationship. When they heard about John's recent argument with Brittney, they called him over to the police station for questioning. John was a soft-spoken person. He told the detectives that he loved Brittney, and he himself was shocked upon hearing the news of her disappearance. John told the detectives that the last time he'd met Brittney was on July 10, 2004. As they'd been having troubles in their relationship, Brittney, in an attempt to calm things down, gave him a letter where she expressed how important their relationship was to her. She apologized for her behavior and even suggested that they could remain friends at the least. The last time John had spoken to Brittney was when they had the argument over the phone on July 11, 2004. He confirmed that they'd been fighting and that Brittney had hung up the phone when she got overly frustrated with him. John also told them that Brittney said she wasn't going to speak to him again. Since there wasn't any evidence against John yet, the detectives couldn't press charges. The police made John take a polygraph test, which he passed. Even though John was given a clean chit, he wasn't completely ruled out as a potential suspect. The police wanted to question Brittney's friends next. She had a very tight circle of friends who knew her and her family inside out. They told the detectives that Brittney's family had a history of drugs, and there were always strange people coming in and out of the house. The police found this information quite suspicious and went back to Brittney's family to learn more. A skim through Brittney's diary and an intense round of interrogation with her family uncovered a lot of the family's buried secrets. In 1989, when Brittney was only 8 months old, she was sent to live with her great-grandmother, Beatrice Wood. Mrs. Wood had taken custody of both Brittney and her sister, Barbara Jo, until their mother could straighten her life out. Brittney's parents, Deborah Gregory and Mr. Dunn, had never actually been married to each other. Deborah suffered from a drug problem for years, and that's why she separated from Brittney and Barbara Jo's father and gave their custody to Mrs. Wood. She even got herself enrolled in a Christian drug rehabilitation program in Florida, but dropped out after she started dating another resident in the program. Apart from Brittney and Barbara Jo, Deborah also had 3 other children with a man she was married to for several years who died in a car accident. Ocean County Family Court records showed that custody of Brittney and Barbara Jo had been changed 3 times in the 90s, until the 2 girls finally ended up with Mr. Dunn on December 3, 1997. Mr. Dunn had his own share of problems. He'd served 5 months in prison in 1991 for burglary and drug possession. He was arrested again on November 15, 2000 for cocaine possession and sentenced to probation. Mr. Dunn also had a long history of drug use. He had many shady associates and sketchy individuals were in and out of the house all the time. The police asked if any of those sketchy people had been to Mr. Dunn's house on the day Brittney went missing. Brittney's sister, Barbara Jo, gave the detectives a name. It was her ex-boyfriend, Tony. Barbara Jo said Tony was often too friendly with Brittney, and that became one of the main reasons why Barbara Jo broke up with him. When the police went to speak with Tony and questioned him of his whereabouts on the night of Brittney's disappearance, Tony gave them an alibi. He said he was at home with his new girlfriend at the time. Tony was not charged, but neither was he completely cleared as a suspect. There were various leads and tips, which only led to dead ends. The case stalled for days. The detectives were working hard to find her body and hopefully the truth behind her disappearance. Brittney's case had stunned the working-class Jersey Shore community. To show their love and support for Brittney, some neighbors formed their own search parties, while others wore ribbons that said, "Find Brittney." By mid-July 2004, since there were no ransom calls or any other signs of Brittney, she was now presumed dead. But Brittney's case finally made some progress. An informant, who chose to remain unnamed, gave the detectives some information about a new suspect. The informant told the police about a man named Jack Fuller Jr., who was a 38-year-old known drug user with a criminal record, and also an associate of Brittney's dad, Mr. Dunn. The informant said that Jack had told him he hurt his back while digging up a grave to bury a girl he'd killed. After hearing of Brittney's disappearance on the news, the informant decided to come forward and speak up. They learned that Brittney knew Jack through his daughter, Cassandra. Cassandra Fuller had dated Brittney's brother, William, but their relationship had deteriorated after he went to prison. On one occasion, Cassandra Fuller and Brittney had found Jack passed out from a drug overdose. Brittney had cried looking at him. She had cared for him a little. After the informant's confession, the detectives were now on to Jack. They planned to get his confession on tape through a sting operation. On Friday, July 16, 2004, the informant made a plan to meet Jack at a convenience store. The detectives had the informant wear a wire while the police waited close by. New Jersey was a one-person consent state, meaning an individual was allowed to record the conversation they took part in without the other person's consent. Sadly, Jack didn't reveal any information about Brittney or the location of where he killed her, but he did say he wanted to kill someone else, a man named Tommy. Jack mentioned that Tommy was there that night when Brittney was looking for a ride to John's place. He was the last person to see Brittney alive. The Tommy that Jack was talking about was Jack's childhood friend, Tommy Long. He was another career criminal. Jack actually had plans to go over to Tommy's house after meeting with the informant. The police managed to reach Tommy's house before Jack did and set up surveillance there. Shortly after, the detectives found Jack's car abandoned near Tommy's house, but Jack appeared a few minutes later with a gas can. Jack was arrested on suspicion of Brittney's murder and brought into the police station for questioning. Tommy Long was brought in for an interrogation as well. At first, Tommy resisted and was reluctant to speak about Jack. But that was until the police played Jack's conversation with the informant and revealed to him how Jack was planning to take him out. Upon listening to Jack's conversation, Tommy told the police everything he knew. He said that he and Jack were driving around on July 11, 2004, and decided to go to Mr. Dunn's. A few minutes later, when they were leaving, Jack told Tommy that he was going to drop him off. But before they could leave, Brittney got into Jack's car as well and asked if they could drop her at her boyfriend John's house. A little while later, Jack dropped Tommy off at his house and then went with Brittney to drop her to her boyfriend's place as she'd requested. Tommy claimed that it was then that Jack must have killed the girl. Jack was confronted with this information, but he said that he didn't know what they were talking about. He denied having any involvement in Brittney's disappearance and asked for an attorney. While the police were trying to get Jack to confess, another witness came forward. A woman called up the police and told them that Jack had abducted her some time ago. She claimed to know where Jack most likely took Brittney. The woman was a drug addict, and Jack had promised her a supply of drugs. Little did she know that it was all a trap. The woman said Jack held her hostage for a few months, but somehow she managed to escape. The woman told the detectives about a spot in the Greenville section of Lakewood, New Jersey, where Jack liked to go and get high. The place was less than 2 miles away from Jack's home. On Tuesday, July 27, 2004, almost 2 weeks after Brittney's disappearance, the police had a search team go out into the area the woman had described. This area had already been searched by some crews, helicopters, and dogs the previous week, but nothing was discovered. This tip from the woman was the detectives' last hope of solving Brittney's case. If whatever the woman claimed turned out to be false, they'd be back to square one. Detectives Mark Byrne and Elliot Morgan believed that a fresh set of eyes was required for this search, and so members from the state police and other neighboring police departments and search dogs were all brought in to investigate the scene. Some of the officers had been on their day off, but had asked permission to continue the search and bring their dogs along with them. When one searcher found an area in the woods with an arm sticking out, he alerted the other team members.
It was just hundreds of law enforcement officers searching multiple locations. We had airplanes from the FBI, we had Coast Guard helicopters. We had whatever we needed that we thought was going to help find her.
At around 9 a.m., Brittney's unclothed body was discovered. There was a necklace around the neck with Brittney's name on it, which helped confirm her identity. Brittney's grief-stricken family received the numbing news of her body's discovery at around 1 p.m. that same day.
Until she's found, we don't know anything. We don't know what to believe, what not to believe. We don't know if she's dead or alive until we have her body.
The family remained in Mr. Dunn's home for hours, consoling each other while struggling to come to grips with the terrible news. One of Brittney's aunts, Susan Wood, was the only relative who attended the afternoon news conference on the day of the gruesome discovery. She wept softly upon hearing details of the scene and was too disturbed to speak to any reporters afterwards. But before she left, she stopped to tightly hug the officers who found Brittney's body before managing to whisper her thanks. The officers refused to say whether the girl's body had been clothed when found or whether it bore any signs of trauma or assault. They stated that it was too early to determine Brittney's cause of death and where she died. A funeral was organized and Brittney was laid to rest in Forest Green Park Cemetery, Morganville, Monmouth County, New Jersey. While investigating the case further to confirm Jack's involvement in Brittney's murder, the detectives found out that Jack's car, a town Chevy Cavalier, had been spotted by an officer at the crime scene around the time of Brittney's disappearance. When the officer approached Jack to ask him what he was doing in the area, he told the officer that his dog had gone missing and he was looking for him. Jack wasn't questioned any further and was let go. Jack's car was sent in for a closer inspection and traces of blood were found inside. When a sample of that blood was tested against Brittney, it came back as a match. This, along with the witnesses and Jack's voice recordings on the tape, was enough evidence to arrest Jack. In 2004, Jack Fuller Jr. of Howell was charged with the first-degree murder of Brittney Mae Gregory and booked into the Ocean County Jail, where he was held on a $1 million bond. Even then, he maintained his innocence and denied having anything to do with Brittney's murder. More than a year later, on Tuesday, October 18, 2005, Jack pleaded guilty to murdering Brittney on the night of July 11, 2004. Jack stated that he punched Brittney at least twice in the face and head because she'd tried to stop him from smoking crack while he was giving her a ride to her boyfriend's house. After the beating, Brittney began making choking and gurgling sounds. As blood dripped from her nose and mouth, Jack continued to get high. By the time he paid any attention to Brittney, she had stopped breathing. On Friday, January 13, 2006, 40-year-old Jack walked into Judge Vincent J. Grasso's Toms River courtroom for sentencing. With a shaved head, goatee, and multiple tattoos on his body, Jack kept a straight face throughout the hearing. When asked if he'd like to address the court before Grasso handed down his sentence, Jack simply replied, "No, sir." Jack's attorney, John Goins, did not say anything either in Jack's defense. Instead, he asked Grasso to just sentence his client. Judge Grasso sentenced Jack to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of 16-year-old Brittney Gregory. Brittney's family and friends filled 3 rows of seats behind Jack. Deborah Gregory, Brittney's mother, was the only member of the victim's family to address the court. She said that Brittney's family didn't believe Jack was telling the whole truth about her daughter's murder. She questioned why Fuller took Brittney, why he let her die instead of taking her to a hospital, why he took her clothes off before he buried her, and why he chose not to tell the police where he buried her body. Deborah further said that losing her daughter was a heart-wrenching feeling, and there were still so many unanswered questions. She believed that the truth of Brittney's death would die with Jack. Deborah even wore a ring that Brittney was wearing on her finger when her body was discovered. It bore shovel marks. Calling Brittney her little angel, Deborah Gregory said her daughter died for something she so strongly believed in, her abhorrence for drugs. Deborah's final words addressing the court were, "He's escaping life in prison, but he won't be escaping his own lie. God will have his day with him." Adding on to Jack's sentence, Grasso gave Jack 5 years of parole for aggravating factors should Jack live to be 70 years old, which was the age he'd be upon his release. In 2008, Brick Memorial High School, where Brittney went to school, started a forensics program in memory of Brittney. John said he felt guilty that he didn't drive back to pick up Brittney when she called. They were in love, and Brittney had even asked him to marry her when she turned 18. She wanted to raise a family with him. Mrs. Wood, Brittney's great-grandmother, said that Brittney never seemed tempted by drugs herself. She didn't go out much. Instead, she stayed in and did her homework. Mrs. Wood said that Brittney had planned to visit her in Las Vegas in August 2004. Before the tragic incident, Brittney had written a letter to Mrs. Wood thanking her for sending $25 for her prom. She also stated that she missed and loved her and would visit soon. While her loved ones would never be able to fully be whole again after her loss, they were given some small form of peace, knowing that the man responsible for her death was now facing the consequences. Do you think that Jack Fuller Jr. told the whole truth about the crime he committed? Or do you feel that the authorities chose to hide some sensitive information from Brittney's family about her murder? When a stabbing took place in the early summer of 2003 in a quiet small town of Altrincham, Greater Manchester, England, police seemed to be on top of it. However, in a shocking turn of events, as the truth unfolded in this bizarre case, things were not at all what they seemed. This case is a prime example of how even the most seemingly straightforward cases can have the most shocking surprises in store. This goes to show that in the world of crime, truth is often stranger than fiction. But what really went down in this case? And what was the insane truth veiled under all the lies? Altrincham is a bustling town located in Greater Manchester, England. With a rich history dating back to the 13th century, the town has a mix of modern amenities and charming historical sites. Well known for its outdoor markets, Altrincham offers a range of handmade artistries and street food. The town center is filled with a variety of shops, cafes, and restaurants, making it a popular destination for visitors and locals alike. Altrincham is also home to several parks which are perfect for picnics and recreational activities. However, Altrincham is also the place where one of the strangest crimes in history took place. Just before 8 p.m. on Sunday, a scorching summer day of June 29, 2003, the police were called to an alley behind a row of shops in the Goose Green area in Altrincham, a town in Greater Manchester, England, where a stabbing had taken place. They arrived on the scene to see a 14-year-old teenager fighting for his life, bleeding to death after receiving multiple stab wounds. Standing close by was a 16-year-old boy who'd been the one who alerted the police to the crime. He introduced himself as a friend to the victim, who was at that point lying there in a pool of blood. For the sake of this story, we'll now refer to them as John, the 14-year-old victim, and Mark, the 16-year-old friend. Their real identities were never made public due to their young ages. John suffered 2 stab wounds, one in the chest, which was comparatively more shallow, and another in the abdomen, which was 6 inches deep. A large kitchen knife, covered in blood, was laying on the ground a few feet away from John. While John was on the brink of death, paramedics were fighting to keep him alive. Within minutes, he was taken to the Wythenshawe Hospital while police commenced their search for answers. Police began the investigation by interviewing Mark, the only witness to the crime. Still sobbing and hysterical from what he'd just witnessed, the 16-year-old told police that he and John were walking down the alleyway of Goose Green sipping soft drinks from a nearby McDonald's when they were attacked by an unknown man. The man tried to grab John into the alley and stabbed John 2 times during this unprovoked attack before running off. Mark stood there watching and quivering in fear. Mark described the man to be possibly in his early 20s, wearing a black hoodie and black jeans with a baseball cap. John was admitted to the hospital with life-threatening injuries. The 6-inch stab wound in his abdomen pierced his kidney and liver. Blood pooled inside his body cavity, and this restricted the movement of his diaphragm, which stopped the functioning of his lungs. Surgeons were forced to remove his gallbladder. On the operation table, the boy's heart stopped 2 times. After barely escaping death, John thankfully survived the attack. But for days, he lay in a hospital bed, placed on a respirator, and carefully monitored. The community was shell-shocked in the wake of the incident. The alley of Goose Green where the stabbing occurred lay off Stamford New Road, close to a shopping mall in the prosperous Manchester suburb of Altrincham, where, other than an occasional shoplifting, crimes simply didn't occur. Naturally, the whole town went into panic mode, thinking that a predator was at large roaming around the town in search of young children. The stabbings were also heavily publicized in the local media. Police shared the description of the attacker and urged the public to provide any significant information they might have. Multiple newspapers were reporting the alleged sightings of a man who fit the description of the assailant. However, nothing came of these alleged sightings. Investigators were concerned that with no clue to suggest the motive for the attack, the assailant might strike again. Even with all these concerns, the investigation was like any other. Investigators knew that they needed more evidence than the vague description of the man. While still appealing for witnesses to contact them, authorities seized hours of CCTV footage of the surrounding area, hoping that a camera would have caught a glimpse of the hooded knifeman. Luckily for them, one closed-circuit camera at the base of the alley had recorded all the foot traffic, including the 2 boys. In the footage, the 2 boys were seen going into the alleyway 25 minutes earlier than the alleged stabbing. Although the actual stabbing was not captured, both Mark and John were seen most of the time. Shockingly, they found out that no hooded man ever entered the alleyway. It was at this point that the seemingly straightforward case became one of the most unusual cases to go down in history. Within 10 days of the incident, the case had taken a complete turn. The suspicion was now on Mark, the 16-year-old boy who was initially considered the lone witness of this horrific stabbing. It was apparent to the investigators that John was not stabbed by any hooded knifeman, but by his own friend, Mark. But there were more questions than answers. Why would he attack his friend? When Mark was confronted by the investigators with the CCTV footage, he changed his story and admitted to stabbing his friend. But no one could have anticipated what he told them next. He claimed that he'd been recruited by a supposed British agent who worked for the Secret Service. This supposed agent persuaded Mark to kill his friend over an internet chat room. He'd been given detailed instructions on how to commit the crime. Additionally, he was also promised that he'd be recruited into the British Secret Service and be able to meet the Prime Minister, along with being given a gun and up to £500,000 in cash. Investigators did not believe Mark was telling the truth. They rather assumed that he was making up the story to get suspicion off him. They seized his computer and made another startling discovery. When investigators seized Mark's computer, they found 58,000 lines of text within the chat room. Investigators realized that, absurd as it sounded, Mark really was telling the truth this time. However, investigators were still trying to piece together this strange puzzle. They decided to dig deeper into Mark's life. Mark lived a perfectly normal life for the most part. He belonged to a respectful working-class family in Stockport, Manchester, and he was quite close with his parents. In school, he did reasonably well in academics, but he excelled in sports. He was also known as a likable and popular guy. According to his school records, he'd never been in any trouble. At 16, he was in college, which is normal in the UK, and also worked part-time in a restaurant. Like most 16-year-olds at the time, Mark spent time on his computer and often logged into internet chat rooms. Mark had no idea that his life was about to take a dark turn when, just 6 months before the stabbing, he discovered a chat room dedicated to Manchester teenagers. Like many others, this popular MSN chat room also provided features where users could make friends, chat, post pictures, share interests and gossip, and also see others via webcam if they wished to. Mark was using the chat room to make friends and meet girls in the Manchester area. It did not take long for Mark to get addicted to these chats, and he began to spend hours on his computer. It was here that Mark met his victim, John. Among many in the chat room, Mark set his eyes on one girl who went by Rachel. She described herself as a 16-year-old who worked in a local gym. After 2 days of conversation, Rachel introduced her 14-year-old stepbrother, John, to Mark. The trio stayed in touch over the chat room for the next 3 months and talked about their similar interests, such as football, films, relationships. While Mark and John were becoming best friends, Mark was falling in love with Rachel, and apparently she reciprocated his feelings. They seemed to be having a whirlwind romance based solely on the chat room itself, since Rachel claimed she did not have a webcam. Despite the pair's numerous plans to meet in person, they never laid eyes on each other as excuses piled up from Rachel's side. Yet Mark did not seem to mind and even professed his love for Rachel in the chat room. While Mark was naive enough to embrace the internet world as his own, the last thing we want is our personal information getting leaked on the internet. 3 months before the stabbing, a new person entered the chat room, as well as Mark's virtual life too. The person, who went by Kevin, openly introduced himself to the chat room as a gay stalker who had a foot fetish. Nobody in the chat room took him seriously until he made a shocking claim. He emailed Mark saying that he kidnapped his virtual girlfriend, Rachel. Kevin further claimed that she'd be released on one condition: if Mark agreed to masturbate on a webcam while showing his feet. Strangely, it did not set off alarm bells for Mark, and instead of going to the authorities, he readily agreed to Kevin's demands. After this, Kevin announced that he'd released Rachel, and for a brief time, she returned to the chat room. But after a few days, Rachel stopped communicating altogether. Eventually, Mark was told by Kevin that Rachel was once again kidnapped and, this time, murdered. Even then, Mark stayed quiet and never called the police. Despite claiming to be very distraught over Rachel's death, Mark continued using the chat room. In fact, it was after Rachel's supposed death that Mark and John's friendship strengthened. While Mark never got to meet Rachel, he was hanging out with John outside of the chat room. Even with the age difference between the two boys, they were fast becoming best friends. Just a few weeks after Rachel's demise, Mark found interest in another teenage girl who introduced herself as Lindsay East. Their conversation began as casual at first, but soon shared intimate details with each other. The situation got weirder when Lindsay confessed to Mark that she was part of a junior Secret Service agent for the British Intelligence Service, commonly known as MI6. She further revealed that she only joined this MSN chat room with the purpose of tracking down Kevin, Rachel's supposed killer, who was now targeting her stepbrother, John. John, who was unaware of the situation, was supposedly under government protection. Lindsay also claimed that she was hoping that Mark would help her in her mission. Immediately after this conversation, Mark did not hear from Lindsay for days. Then a post-dated email was sent to Mark, which Lindsay had arranged in case she was killed in action. In the email, Lindsay requested that Mark complete her unfinished work of protecting John. It was another sad end in Mark's online love life, but the strange twists certainly did not stop here. In an unbelievable turn of events, at the end of April 2003, Rachel reappeared in the chat room. Though Mark was happy to hear she was alive, he was stunned at the same time. However, he quickly realized that there was something wrong with Rachel's story. Rachel claimed to have been held captive while being in a coma. It's not clear how much of this story Mark believed, but Rachel soon disappeared from the chat room for a final time. Even with all these far-fetched stories, Mark kept going back to the chat room and following his usual routine. He then found himself engaged in a conversation with someone who went by the name Janet Dobinson. However, unlike the previous instances, this time the woman was not a teenager. She introduced herself as a 44-year-old attractive married woman living with her husband and 2 children. To the outside world, she was a real estate agent. However, she revealed to Mark that she really worked as a spy for the British Secret Service, similar to Lindsay, but in a much higher position. In fact, she claimed to be the 3rd most powerful woman in England. Always writing in capital letters, Janet made her intentions very clear from the start, that she was not there for any adolescent conversations, but to recruit a teenager in the Secret Service. In her words, Mark perfectly fit the description for that role. But as per her demands, Mark needed to prove his worthiness and loyalty before he could be taken to London for his MI6 training. Although Mark was skeptical of the job, he could not refuse such a lucrative offer and went along with Janet's game plan. Janet told Mark that as a part of his initiation process in the MI6, he was required to secretly work as a bodyguard for a Manchester teen and a fellow MI6 operative, James Bell. He was instructed by Janet that James should never know that Mark had been tasked with keeping an eye on him. Being a James Bond fan himself, Mark was delighted to work as a part of MI6, but he was still curious to know what made James so important. To answer that, Janet told him an elaborate story about a secret safe hidden at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean that only a few countries knew about, but only the Queen of England had the combination to open. Since the Queen was not physically capable of opening the safe, she entrusted the codes to only one other person, and that person was James Bell. However, Mark was about to get yet another shock. He soon learned that James Bell was none other than his best friend, John. Even after this shocking revelation, Mark did not say anything to John. Instead, he started to spend more time with them in order to fulfill his duties. They were even having sleepovers more often. Meanwhile, Mark reported all his actions to Janet back in the chat room, and she was satisfied with his progress. Mark's next assignment was to get John out of the school without raising suspicion, and he was able to complete that task as well. Within a few days, Janet was ready with another assignment for Mark. His last task before being officially recruited by the MI6 was very odd. He was told to have an encounter to make John look gay. However, Janet refused to elaborate on this plot, but warned him that his failure might affect national security, as well as losing her job. Soon after, Mark told Janet that he and John had watched pornography together. He was overjoyed when Janet informed him that he'd been officially appointed as a spy. However, his first mission was nothing he could have ever expected. Janet ordered Mark to kill John. The same John she'd instructed Mark to protect all this time. His best friend. Mark could not believe it. At first he considered that Janet might be testing him, but she was adamant that the country was depending on him. She said that John was planning a school shooting or something similar to that, which made it necessary for the British government to get rid of him. When Mark protested that he didn't want to murder his best friend, Janet reassured him, saying that it wouldn't be murder in John's case. Janet told Mark that John was suffering from a terminal illness and killing him would be a mere mercy killing. As a reward for the successful completion of Mark's assignment, Janet promised him that he'd receive £80 million in cash, meet the then PM Tony Blair, the Queen, and receive sexual favors from Janet herself. Mark even had been given a code name, 47695, as well as an abort code, 6969, in case the mission was to be cancelled. Janet even went on to outline specific instructions regarding what kind of knife Mark should use, what boots to wear, and the location where he was to carry out his mission. Although Mark agreed to do the job, he still had his doubts. Yet a few days later, John confided in Mark, revealing he had a brain tumor, which cemented Mark's faith in Janet's credibility. Indeed, on the evening of June 29, 2003, Mark carried out this preposterous plan. Mark and John spent the entire day together. He even bought a 6-inch long knife while the pair were out shopping. When John asked Mark about the knife, he lied, saying that it was a gift for his mother. It was getting dark when Mark and John entered Goose Green Alley. In this alleyway, far away from surveillance footage, Mark stabbed his friend, once in the chest and once in the stomach. Following Janet's orders, he waited 20 minutes before calling an ambulance. Janet never showed up as she'd previously promised. When the police arrived, Mark hastily made up the story about the hooded knifeman. When John regained consciousness, investigators questioned him. He initially confirmed Mark's claims about a stranger attacking them in the alley, telling police that he also did not know the identity of the knife-holding assailant. Once confronted with Mark's confession, John admitted it was his best friend Mark who had stabbed him, but he could not give any explanation as to why the attack had happened. Nevertheless, Mark was arrested in July 2003 and detained in a juvenile detention center on the charge of attempted murder. He could not understand why Janet had not come to his rescue. Police, however, assumed there was possibly a pedophile, or even a group of pedophiles, behind the online persona of the mysterious spy mistress, and investigators turned to the task of trying to find the true identity behind Janet Dobinson. Although the hunt for the true identity of Janet Dobinson was immediately launched, it would take 3 months before police even began to unravel the truth. The amount of material discovered on Mark's computer was staggering. Criminal intelligence analyst Sally Hogg was given the task of analyzing the staggering 58,000 lines of text recovered from Mark's computer. Sally discovered that in addition to Rachel, Kevin, Lindsay, and Janet, Mark regularly chatted with many other profiles over the chat room whom he never even met in real life. As she began to dig deeper, she discovered a web of lies and deceit that went far beyond anyone's imagination. After initially believing that all the personas were different people, however, in a shocking turn of events, investigators discovered that nothing was what it seemed to be. The twist in this case was so unexpected and surreal that it left everyone speechless. Sally Hogg was shocked to learn that all the profiles were linked to one individual. It was a carefully constructed virtual universe, placing Mark in the center. And the orchestrator of this game was none other than John himself. Unlike Mark, John did not grow up in a home filled with love and laughter. While he lived with his mother, he had no recollection of his biological father, who apparently attempted to abduct him as a child. He grew up believing one of his stepfathers to be his real father before inadvertently discovering the truth. His drug-addicted stepfather left the family when John was only 7. As a child, he often watched his mother weeping at home, and then when he went to school, he was tormented by bullies. From a young age, these incidents took a toll on his mental health. Despite earning excellent grades in school, he was aloof and withdrawn. When John was 11, his mother settled down with a man after multiple failed relationships. Unfortunately, John's relationship with his new stepfather was not good. This, with the added struggle of his sexual orientation, sent him into a state of deep depression. So when his mother gifted him a computer to help him with his schoolwork on his 13th birthday, John turned to the internet to escape his real-life struggles and entered into a world of fantasy. Perhaps fantasy was the only thing John wanted to explore by pretending to be dozens of characters in the chat room. He took solace in the fact that, in his virtual world, he could be anyone he wanted to be. By February 2003, John was contacting 20 to 30 people a night in MSN chat rooms, and within a week, he stumbled upon Mark. Once John had introduced himself as Rachel's brother, the two boys just clicked. As they bonded over the interests they commonly shared, John became obsessed with Mark. Fearing that Mark would soon abandon him after Rachel's demise, John created other personas and an elaborate web of deceit in order to keep Mark interested in him. The trick worked when Mark spent time with them as a part of the assignment for the British Secret Service. But his joy did not last long, as John realized the virtual universe John had so carefully constructed was fast slipping out of control. Whether the 14-year-old boy felt it would be impossible to get out from under all the lies he told, or he truly did not want to continue with his life, was never revealed. However, John was pulling the strings of his own murder behind the curtains, while Mark played the role of a puppet, which ended up in a horrific mess. At the end of May 2004, the two boys ended up in court, where neither boy so much as glanced at the other. During the trial, when the mystery was unveiled, Mark said that he could not believe he'd been so gullible, while John never said a word. Mark pleaded guilty to attempted murder and was sentenced to a 2-year supervision order. John eventually pleaded guilty to inciting his own murder, being the only person in British history to be charged with that offense. John was also charged with perverting the course of justice and sentenced to a 3-year supervision order, during which time he was not allowed to enter chat rooms or use the internet unsupervised. The two boys are never allowed to contact each other again. Judge David Madison noted that skilled writers would struggle to conjure up a plot such as that which arises here. The judge further added that under normal circumstances, the crimes would have resulted in extremely lengthy jail sentences. However, the circumstances could not be described as such, and he believed time in prison would not be beneficial to either boy. As of now, Mark would be 32 and John 30. Their true identities are forever protected. The twist in this case was so unexpected and surreal that it left everyone speechless. It's one of those rare cases that makes you question everything you thought you knew about human nature. Have you ever heard a more puzzling story than this? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. When 16-year-old Kim Bryant went missing from a Dairy Queen across the street from Western High School in Las Vegas, everybody thought she ran away. She'd expressed thoughts of doing so in the past. Not days later, a shocking discovery changed the course of the investigation altogether. Yet, with its many twists and turns, the case remained unsolved over 4 decades. However, as time passed, new evidence and fresh perspectives emerged, reigniting the investigation and bringing hope for closure. Did Kim really run away from her home? Or were some secrets yet to be let out of the bag? Las Vegas, Nevada is an iconic and vibrant city, known as the city that never sleeps. Las Vegas has a population of over 650,000 people and is a mecca for tourists. Famous for the extravagant nightlife, luxurious hotels, and world-renowned casinos, Las Vegas is known as the entertainment capital of the world. Apart from its unique blend of glamour and excitement, this one-of-a-kind city also showcases the city's rich history and unique culture. For some, this is the place where dreams come true. Sadly, this is also the place where, in 1979, one family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered dreams. Today's story takes us to the morning of January 26, 1979, when 16-year-old sophomore Kim Bryant joined her classmates at Western High School in Las Vegas for registration day to choose her classes for the upcoming year. After finishing the registration for new classes, Kim walked with a friend across Decatur Boulevard, a busy street on the western side of the city. The girls stopped at a Dairy Queen, a fast food restaurant located directly across the street from the Western High School football field. It was about 10 a.m. It was still a few hours before the restaurant opened for the day, but the students flocked to a nearby parking lot to hang out. The day was passing as normal until a late 1950s Chevy with a sanded silver gray primer finish and sporting raised back wheels pulled up in front of the Dairy Queen. 2 young men in the car passed some obscene comments to the high school girls, to which Kim and her friend responded back with some indecent words of their own. As the situation went sour, the car sped off into the traffic along the southbound road. Not long after this altercation, Kim was offered a lift from her friend who came to pick up her daughter. Kim asked her to wait a minute while she ran to a nearby payphone to call her boyfriend. She quickly returned and thanked her for the offer, but she told them that her boyfriend was on his way to give her a ride home. It was about 10:10 a.m. when they drove off, leaving Kim alone in front of the Dairy Queen. Kim's boyfriend pulled into the parking lot of the Dairy Queen at about 10:30 a.m., but there was no sign of his girlfriend. He waited for a few minutes before driving off, assuming that Kim must have caught a ride with someone else. Back at Kim's home on Banjo Circle, Las Vegas, Kim's mother, Sherry Elliott, became concerned when her daughter had not returned home. That day, Kim was supposed to go shopping with her mother around 12:30 p.m., and Sherry knew Kim would never miss out on a shopping trip, especially without calling. With a foreboding feeling that she just couldn't shake, Sherry headed out to look for her daughter, but couldn't find any trace of her. At 5:30 p.m., Kim's mother and stepfather went to the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department to file a missing persons report. Although Sherry was confident that Kim was in trouble, the officers speculated that Kim ran away from home. The belief was further strengthened when they learned about a verbal fight between Kim and her parents that took place the night before. Kim's parents kept insisting that she'd always call if she was late, but the police said it sounded like their daughter had run away and was probably staying at a friend's house. They wanted to wait a few days to see if Kim came home. This was common protocol for police departments in those days. Desperate to find their missing daughter, Kim's parents reached out to the local media to spread the word about the disappearance, but the media outlets refused to take any action until Kim was officially reported missing. After a full day of futile efforts to find her by themselves, Kim's parents demanded that more action be taken to locate her. Finally, detectives with the Juvenile Division went to Kim's house in an attempt to find clues, and they discovered the missing girl's diary. Parts of the diary contained scribblings about her desire to run away from home, which further confirmed their belief. For the time being, this remained a low-priority case. Kim's disappearance didn't pique law enforcement attention until police learned that Kim's backpack was found. Surprisingly, the same day when Kim went missing, sometime around noon, a motorist driving along Decatur and Charleston Boulevard in Las Vegas noticed a backpack lying abandoned in the middle of the street. Upon opening the bag, the man discovered a purse containing a driver's license belonging to Kim Bryant, along with textbooks and gym clothes. He even called Kim's home, but nobody answered. However, authorities only learned about this incident a week later. This prompted them to officially declare Kim a missing person and finally start an investigation into the disappearance. Despite a massive search effort, authorities failed to come up with anything. Kim's story was published in the local newspaper, but there was still no sign of the teen. On the afternoon of February 20th, 1979, nearly a month after Kim Bryant vanished into thin air, 3 teenage boys were hiking through the desert on the western edge of Las Vegas, which was 4 miles from the school. Near the power substation at the edge of Buffalo Avenue and Charleston Boulevard, in the underdeveloped deserted area, one of the boys noticed something unusual. It seemed like a wig was tangled amidst the dirt and rocks. As they approached to get a closer look, they discovered the lifeless body of a woman lying face down in a shallow grave covered with debris. Authorities were immediately alerted. After examining the crime scene, the body was quickly identified as Kim Bryant from a rabbit fur coat found nearby, which Kim was wearing when she disappeared. Her body was partially clothed and naked from the waist down, which suggested that she'd been sexually assaulted prior to her murder. Detectives determined that Kim had likely been struck in the head with a rock multiple times, possibly with one of the stones scattered near the disposal site. Her hands sustained many defensive injuries, indicating that she had put up a fight with her killer before ultimately losing her life. From the crime scene, it was also apparent that the killer had most likely tried to hide the body, hoping nobody would find it. Her body was taken to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. The autopsy results further confirmed the theory of assault, and the cause of death was also listed as blunt force trauma. Foreign DNA was also collected from her body and was kept in reserve for future testing. But the result also revealed something else, and potentially the most tragic aspect of the story. Initially, authorities believed that Kim had been murdered shortly after her disappearance, but the autopsy report suggested that she was kept alive for up to 4 days after the abduction. However, the report could not provide any significant leads to find the perpetrator. As the community of Las Vegas was terrified by the gruesome slaying of Kim Bryant, and her heartbroken family was left mourning her loss, homicide detectives were on the hunt for the killer. In the days following the discovery of Kim's body, tips flooded into the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. One of the most alarming tips came from a group of individuals who claimed to have witnessed Kim's abduction by several men in a Jeep. However, the accused individuals associated with the Jeep provided solid alibis to investigators. There was another lead where one man claimed that he'd witnessed the murder, but later admitted that he made the statement after overhearing a group of local kids talking about the crime. After an initial flurry of investigative activity, the leads began to dwindle after a few months. With an increasing number of homicides in Las Vegas in that year, investigators were stretched thin. Under the burden of a heavy workload, detectives were forced to shift their attention to the new cases, and Kim's case lay dormant in the files. With no concrete leads to follow up on, the case was slowly turning cold with each passing day. The case caught its first significant break in the summer of 1979 after a local newspaper ran a lengthy feature on the status of the investigation and how the crime affected the Las Vegas community. The news feature also refreshed the memory of two of Kim's classmates at Western High School. The female students, whose identity has never been released in public, said that around the time of Kim's disappearance, they'd been approached by two men driving a Chevy. The men attempted to lure the girls into their car with an offer to sell them jewelry, but the girls grew suspicious when they peered into the back seat and saw only a large walnut-grained speaker. After the girls rejected the offer, the men drove away while verbally abusing them. The girls described the car as silver with light primer spots and raised back wheels bearing Nevada plates. The two students also provided independent descriptions of the passenger of the car. This description allowed the detectives to develop the first sketch of a potential suspect in the Kim Bryant case. The seemingly 18 or 19-year-old man in the sketch had shaggy blonde hair and droopy stoner eyes. The girls stated that the driver was a man in his early 20s with a mustache and medium brown hair. The girls described both of the men as grubby hippies. Another eyewitness, an older businessman, also came out after the sketch was released to the public and informed the authorities that he too had witnessed Kim being forced into a car, similar to what the two girls described. He said he assumed the incident was nothing more than a high school prank and hadn't reported it to the police. This was a massive development in the case, but unfortunately, this was all the information detectives had to go on, and the investigation slowed down once again after a few busy days. However, it was not the first twist in this puzzling case, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. The next lead came in on the heels of an unexpected tragedy in town. It was the death of a 37-year-old, a local roofer who went missing the day after Kim's abduction. The body of Bobby Jean Thomas was discovered after a month in a steep dirt road about a mile from the Hoover Dam. He died in a gruesome way, suffering approximately 36 stab wounds, including one to the eye. The sadistic killer had tortured him before ending his life, and his body had been brutalized even after his death. But this death seemingly had nothing to do with Kim Bryant's. That is, until authorities found Thomas's killer, Ronnie Lee Fain. Fain, then 24 years of age, was arrested in connection with the murder of Bobby Jean Thomas in early 1980, just a year after the discovery of Thomas's body. Shortly after his arrest, Fain reached out to Las Vegas prosecutors to make a deal. As an allegiance to the deal, he would not only confess to the killing of Bobby Jean Thomas, but in a shocking turn of events, he also provided authorities with information related to the Kim Bryant murder case. On April 22, 1980, Ronnie Lee Fain pleaded guilty to a second-degree murder charge for Bobby Jean Thomas's murder. There, he agreed to give an account of the events leading up to the murder. Fain, who had already spent most of his life imprisoned in the California penal system, moved to Las Vegas after being released from prison in 1978 and settled down in an apartment in downtown Vegas with his girlfriend, Lori Lamson. As a part of the same community, Fain and Bobby had known each other for quite some time. On January 27, 1979, just a day after Kim Bryant had disappeared from the neighborhood, Fain stated that he joined Thomas on a joyride with two other men whom he only knew by their nicknames, Worm and Hulk. As the sun went down, the group made the drive back towards the bright lights of Las Vegas. After dropping off Worm and Hulk, it was just Fain and Thomas in the car, and the two began chatting. At some point, as Fain put it, Thomas, in his drunken state, started to tell his new companion a bone-chilling story. He described how he'd taken part in the abduction, assault, and murder of a teenage girl the day before. Fain claimed, bound by prison honor, he immediately decided to avenge the girl's death. When the car arrived at Fain's place, he told Thomas to wait inside the car and then retrieved a knife from his girlfriend. Upon returning to the car, Fain immediately began attacking and slashing Thomas to death, imposing at least 36 blows from the blade. Fain further described that he then drove out to the desolate area around Hoover Dam to dispose of the corpse. Fain insisted that he was enraged by Thomas's mindless bragging, and that was the only reason he killed him. Although a killer's words are not always trustworthy, authorities took him very seriously. Apparently, before taking the plea deal, Fain passed 2 independently administered lie detector tests before prosecutors accepted his plea. He'd also correctly identified the brand of beer on a bottle that was located near the disposal site of Kim Bryant. But even with this confession, there were more questions than answers. As investigators began looking deeper into the past of Bobby Jean Thomas, they soon learned that Thomas was not a naive victim who lost his life at the hands of Ronnie Lee Fain. Rather, he was indeed someone quite capable of murder. In fact, throughout his life, Thomas had a history of crimes against young women and girls. On a cold winter night in January 1970, Thomas attacked 20-year-old Christine Lee McKinney along Las Vegas Boulevard as she was trying to start her stalled car. Fortunately, she was able to escape the assault, and Thomas was arrested and faced charges of assault with the intent to commit a crime. Just 2 years later, on January 15, 1972, Thomas drugged and assaulted his 14-year-old sister-in-law, Helen Hines, resulting in her death. He was arrested on charges of assault and involuntary manslaughter, but he still made bail. Just days before the trial, Thomas agreed to plead guilty to the statutory assault charge in exchange for having the manslaughter charges dismissed. He was sentenced to the maximum term of 10 years behind bars. However, he was paroled after serving only a portion of his sentence. Around the time of Kim Bryant's murder, Thomas abducted and attempted to sexually assault a young woman in the desert, the same area where he'd meet his own demise not long after. Despite this horrid history, detectives had no physical proof to connect Thomas to Kim, and there were many holes to be poked in this theory. Detective Bob Hilliard, head of the Kim Bryant investigation, was unsure whether Thomas was responsible for Kim Bryant's death. Although he passed 2 polygraph tests, there were several inconsistencies in Fain's story. Hilliard was bothered by the fact that Fain never mentioned Kim's name in his initial confession. Fain also didn't include any details that were not already publicly known about the Kim Bryant case. He initially said all he knew was that Bobby Jean Thomas had assaulted and killed a teenager. It was only after his attorney mentioned the name Kim Bryant that Fain added that to his story. As for the beer bottle discovered near the crime scene, it had been located 70 yards away from her body and looked like it had been there longer than Kim's remains. This could have been left by people just enjoying a drink in the desert. Additionally, Fain's description of the vehicle that Thomas used for the abduction did not match the description of the eyewitnesses. Detectives at this point considered that in his drunken state, Thomas might have mixed up the date of his attempted rape with the day of Kim's abduction when rambling about his actions to Fain. But this was not all. Detectives also discovered a disturbing fact about Ronnie Lee Fain. He appeared to have a thing for stabbing people. Just a month before murdering Thomas, in December of 1978, Fain attacked one of his acquaintances in a downtown apartment in Las Vegas. It wouldn't have been much of a stretch to imagine a sociopath fabricating a story of avenging a young girl's murder in the hopes of a lighter sentence. There was another possibility that investigators couldn't help but consider. It was possible that both Fain and Thomas had been involved in Kim's abduction and murder, but later Fain killed Thomas in an attempt to eliminate a witness against him. Despite all the speculation, the truth was, no one knew if Thomas was really responsible for Kim's death, or if Fain was making up the story. Kim's case remained open despite Fain's claims. By the mid-1980s, Kim Bryant's parents had moved away from Las Vegas to escape from the nightmare of living in a place where their daughter's life was brutally cut short. However, they continued to stay in touch with the police about the status of Kim's case. Around this time, this case would take yet another shocking turn when a new suspect would come into the picture, along with the possibility that Kim was one of several victims of a ruthless cross-country serial killer. The city of Las Vegas witnessed more similar murders in the months and years following the tragedy of Kim's death. Nearly 9 months after Kim Bryant's abduction and murder, on September 25, 1979, 22-year-old Sheila Griffith went missing after leaving the Silver Nugget in Las Vegas with a man. Her body was found on November 27, 1979, in the Mojave Desert near the Nevada state line. 4 months later, on January 16, 1980, 18-year-old Susan Bellotti went missing when she failed to return to her Las Vegas home after a local shopping trip. Her body was found after 5 months on May 26, 1980, near Bloomington, Las Vegas. Then, on June 27, 1980, 20-year-old Cheryl Daniel was abducted from a parking lot in Las Vegas. Her body was found on December 13, 1980, in Hellhole Canyon near St. George, with a gunshot wound to the head. Initially, authorities in Las Vegas suspected that these 4 murders were connected, but they didn't have any evidence leading them to the killer. However, an ID card that was located near Cheryl's body led detectives to a man named Robert Generoso. Robert Generoso arrived in Las Vegas from San Francisco sometime around 1977. He took up painting and insulation installation work at building sites around town. In November of 1977, he married a local school teacher by the name of Sylvia. The couple settled down in a middle-class neighborhood on the western side of the city, which was less than a 10-minute drive from the disposal site of Kim Bryant's body. From the outside, they were a happy family, even welcoming a child in 1980. Yet beneath this happy facade, Robert Generoso was living a life of deception and lies. In a shocking twist, detectives discovered Robert Generoso did not exist. Shortly after the Las Vegas police began investigating Robert Generoso and his role in the murders of Cheryl Daniel, the FBI informed them of Generoso's real identity. Their first link was the ID card under the name of Robert Generoso that was found near Cheryl's body. However, why the FBI didn't arrest him previously is not clear. The real name of the man they were looking for was Stephen Peter Morin. Before moving to Las Vegas, throughout his early life, Generoso had been in and out of jail constantly, both in Florida and San Francisco. On September 26, 1976, Morin tricked and assaulted a 14-year-old girl in his Marina District apartment in San Francisco. As authorities were preparing to apprehend him, he stayed one step ahead of the law and fled to Las Vegas under the alias of Robert Island. He soon took up the name of Robert Generoso after finding the name of a deceased man that was of a similar age and appearance to himself. Unfortunately, authorities were not quick enough to apprehend him, and once again, Morin evaded arrest by fleeing Las Vegas. As detectives were combing through his property to find clues to his whereabouts, they discovered something which provided them more strong reasons to believe that Morin was connected to Kim's murder. In a storage unit owned by Morin off of Valley View Boulevard, detectives discovered a macrame belt similar to the one Kim wore on the day of her disappearance, which was missing from the crime scene. Morin's then estranged wife, Sylvia, who separated from her husband at some point in 1980, provided further links to the Bryant murder when she told police about a broken lighter that Morin had brought home on one occasion. Kim's parents confirmed that their daughter routinely carried a broken gold lighter with her. Kim's parents also recalled that about 2 weeks before her disappearance, she had told them about a new male friend, Joe. This man picked Kim up for skating night at the Playland skating rink on Valley View Boulevard. He was driving a vehicle similar to Morin's dark-colored Ford Ranchero. However, his behavior soon turned aggressive after they arrived at the skating rink. Kim felt so afraid that she asked her ex-boyfriend, who was also present at the rink, for a ride home. On the way back, Kim and her ex-boyfriend were followed by Joe's car in an erratic manner. The ex-boyfriend later identified a photo of Morin as the man present that night at Playland. Even with all of this evidence, authorities failed to make an arrest in days, and even months, which gave him the opportunity to commit a few more crimes. Morin was in Hawaii at this point. Meanwhile, back in Las Vegas, investigators were doing everything in their power to gather enough evidence against him. Perhaps Morin knew that his luck was running out. In December of 1980, Robert would place a few cryptic calls to his estranged wife Sylvia, trying to trick her into saying what the police knew. He insisted that he was being set up by the police. Days later, he traveled to Northern California. Even though Morin was a federal fugitive at this point, he failed to lay low. On January 5, 1981, he was arrested in Pleasanton, California for waving a .45 pistol at 2 men during an argument. However, he was released on $500 bail pending trial after providing the authorities with an alias. After his release, he quickly fled California and hitchhiked around the country. At some point, he began a romantic relationship with the owner of a local antique shop in Buffalo, New York, named Rita Xavier. Somehow, he managed to convince Rita to come down with him on the run. Rita even agreed to sell her store and bought a travel van with the money, and the pair continued to travel. During a brief stint in Denver, Morin kidnapped and murdered a 23-year-old college student, Sheila Whalen, a recent college graduate. Morin and Rita were long gone from Denver at that point, and they headed south to Texas. But soon Rita would return to New York as she grew frustrated seeing Morin constantly checking out other women. Before long, Morin charmed another young woman by the name of Sarah Clark, and she further accompanied him on his murderous journey. On November 30th, 1981, Morin abducted 23-year-old Pamela Jackson from a Corpus Christi apartment complex and held her captive. For the next 11 days, she was sexually assaulted multiple times a day. On December 2nd, 1981, Morin abducted 21-year-old Jenna Bruce from the Hilton Inn parking lot, and her body was found the following day, floating in 2 feet of water in a culvert on Padre Island. Morin murdered 2 more women, both times to steal their cars, as the couple traveled through Texas. Morin and Sarah even kidnapped a woman from an apartment complex in Corpus Christi and forced her to accompany them on their journey. Just 4 days after this mindless murder, on December 6, 1981, Morin shot 29-year-old Michael Reed and 26-year-old Pearl Lutz during an abduction attempt in San Antonio. Fortunately, they both survived. During all these crimes, Morin was always on the move and never stayed in one place. Call it sheer luck or a lack of rapid action on the part of law enforcement, but Morin always stayed one step ahead of them, even when he was keeping Pamela hostage and forcing her to move with him and Sarah. On December 11, 1981, Morin shot 21-year-old Carrie Scott and 25-year-old Drew Valdez outside a San Antonio restaurant while trying to steal Scott's car. While Valdez survived the attack, sadly, Scott succumbed to his injuries. It was the following day of December 12, 1981, that police finally tracked Morin to a hotel in San Antonio, where they located Pamela Jackson alive and were able to arrest Sarah. But Morin managed to slip out a window just moments before police arrived. But he didn't keep quiet. Rather, amidst the police manhunt itself, he abducted another woman from a department store parking lot. But over several hours, the woman managed to convince Morin to turn himself in without further bloodshed, using quotes from Bible verses. Surprisingly, Morin let go of this hostage and called the police from an Austin bus station, where he was soon arrested without incident. Stephen Peter Morin faced 2 separate trials in Texas for 2 completely separate murders and was convicted in both cases and twice sentenced to death by lethal injection. He was also found guilty of 1 murder and received a death sentence in Colorado. Utah was also in line for trial, but ceased its efforts to extradite Morin after his convictions in the Texas cases. Shortly afterward, detectives from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department traveled to Texas to interview Morin about the murders of Kim Bryant, Cheryl Daniel, and Susan Bellotti, but the killer persistently refused to discuss his time in Vegas. Though there was ample circumstantial evidence putting Morin with the motive, means, and opportunity to carry out these slayings, due to a lack of physical evidence, no indictments were ever issued in relation to these crimes. Stephen Peter Morin was finally executed by lethal injection on March 13, 1985, in a Texas prison. Despite this, Kim Bryant's family still had no concrete resolution to her case. With each passing year, the probability of solving this case was decreasing. With the advancements in DNA, the case got further attention. In 2008, the DNA sample that was collected from the victim's body during the autopsy was tested, but they were unable to get a DNA profile. For over a decade, the case remained a cold case. Then, more than a decade later, in January of 2021, a foreign male DNA profile was finally able to be constructed from the evidence left at the crime scene. Investigators ran the profile into CODES, but there was no match. In August 2021, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department homicide investigators contracted Texas DNA lab Othram Inc., a private Texas-based DNA laboratory, to perform advanced genetic testing on the suspect's DNA. This step was only possible due to a generous $5,000 donation from a Las Vegas philanthropist named Justin Wu. The lab was able to build a genealogical profile of the killer from just 15 human cells, which is the smallest amount of DNA ever used in a criminal case. The profile was then uploaded to the commercial DNA database and later to the family tree websites to find a possible match. After putting together all their findings, they contacted the LVMPD. They were hoping that this investigation would lead them back to the past, to one of the many possible suspects. To their shock, the evidence led them in a different direction entirely, to a man by the name of Johnny Blake Peterson, a name which had never come up on their radar in earlier investigations. Johnny Blake Peterson was born on September 12, 1960 in Las Vegas. He was one of several children and attended Western High School, the same school as Kim. Though he was not a student by the time Kim was murdered, the then 19-year-old Peterson was living in the same area. After graduation, he worked in the construction industry as a freelance plasterer. He married a woman named Cindy and had 2 children with her. At some point during his lifetime, he was arrested for the sexual assault of a woman, but it was unclear if he ever served time for this offense. Unfortunately, after all the twists and turns of this case, justice was never to prevail. On January 30th, 1993, Peterson was admitted to the University Medical Center of Southern Nevada due to a drug overdose and died later that same day at the age of 33. In a press conference on November 29, 2021, investigators explained how they'd finally resolved the case after years of false leads and speculation. However, there was one last twist yet to come to light. As detectives were reviewing the cold cases in an attempt to ascertain whether Peterson was connected to any other crimes, they made an appalling discovery. The evidence connected him with another murder that occurred in 1983, nearly 5 years after Kim Bryant's slaying. 22-year-old Diana Hansen was reported missing by her parents after she failed to return home on December 31st, 1983. Her body was found later that day on Spring Mountain Road, approximately 1.5 miles southwest of Buffalo Drive. She'd been sexually assaulted and brutally murdered. DNA evidence was recovered from Diana's body, but no immediate suspect was identified. For the next 38 years, this case too remained cold. It was only when Peterson was identified as a killer in Kim Bryant's case that detectives compared his DNA with the DNA collected from Diana Hansen's body. That testing proved Johnny Blake Peterson was also responsible for Diana Hansen's death. It's truly frustrating that nearly 4 decades passed without the opportunity for the killer ever facing justice in a court of law. Hopefully, these families can finally find some solace knowing who took away their loved ones. What are your thoughts on this puzzling and twisted case? Do you think Peterson really killed Kim? Or could there be other secrets yet to come to light? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section.
911, do you need police, fire, medical?
My daughter's dead. She just had to go in there.
Sir, did she hang herself?
No, she didn't hang herself, but
how old is she?
Around her. She's 11 years old.
On November 29, 2001, 12-year-old Amanda Cope was found strangled to death in her own bed in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Sadly, her own father, Billy Cope, was the one to find her. He immediately went into a state of shock. However, when the police arrived to investigate, they found a very suspicious scene. Who could have done such a thing to a sweet 12-year-old child? And who was the police's main suspect in the case?
Is she breathing?
Oh, no, she's dead. She's cold as a cucumber. And
okay, you don't want to try to CPR or anything on her?
no, ma'am, she's dead. I mean, her mouth is completely shut. She's ice cold.
Okay, when was the last time you saw her live, sir?
About 2 o'clock this morning.
About 2 o'clock this morning. Has she been?
1 o'clock this morning.
Has she been sick or anything?
No, ma'am. The thing was just wrapped around her neck.
Was it her bed clothing or her sheet?
It was her blanket. She just had a blanket laying there, and she rolled over and it wrapped around her neck. It's the green thing on the blanket. She laid on the green blanket with a green blanket, and it had a string wrapped around it. I mean, I gotta call my wife.
Okay. Okay, what kind of house do you live in, sir? What color is your house?
It's white, but she's gone on to be with the Lord because she was a Christian. Please, I really don't.
Okay. All right, sir.
I have my light on.
All right, sir.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
That chilling recording you just heard was the 911 call that 37-year-old Billy Cope made when he found his daughter Amanda dead in her bedroom. In the early hours of November 29, 2001, in Rock Hill, South Carolina, Billy Cope woke up with a start at around 3 a.m. and immediately knew something was wrong in his house. The hall light was on, and he distinctly remembered turning it off before going to bed. His wife, Mary Sue, was out at her overnight job where she cleaned offices, so it was just him and his 3 girls, Amanda, Jessica, and Kyla, at home. Amanda was the oldest at 12 years old, while Jessica and Kyla were 11 and 7 respectively. A devoutly Christian family, they'd missed the Wednesday church service they usually attended that night because Jessica was struggling with her math homework and needed some extra help to complete her assignment. Amanda, always the caring older sister, had offered to help her, and Billy agreed to let the 2 girls stay up as long as was needed to complete the work. The youngest daughter, Kyla, had gone to bed at 9 p.m., but Billy stayed up with the older 2 sisters till 1 a.m., helping them finish their schoolwork. Afterwards, they all headed to bed to get some much-needed rest, and Billy had turned on his CPAP breathing machine that he used to keep his sleep apnea at bay before drifting to sleep. Strangely, just 2 hours later, he was awoken by something. Still half asleep, Billy went to check on his daughters. Amanda's door was shut, and he concluded that perhaps she was the one who turned on the hall light. Maybe she'd gotten up in the middle of the night for a drink of water. The other bedroom door was open, and he saw his 2 younger girls fast asleep in their beds. With his mind more at ease, he returned to his bed, put his breathing machine back on, and quickly fell back to sleep. The following morning at 6 a.m., Billy was awoken by the blaring of his alarm clock. He later stated that during those intermittent hours of sleep, he dreamed about the rapture. In his dream, Jesus had returned to take his followers home. He explained that in his dream, he saw Amanda being taken and him being left behind, with her saying the words, "Bye, Daddy," to him. Still feeling jarred from his intense dream, he quickly left his bed to check on his daughters. He was overwhelmed with relief when he saw his 2 younger girls still sleeping peacefully in their beds. But his comfort was short-lived. As he tried to open Amanda's door, it was caught on the open closet door behind it. After using force to get through the door, he witnessed an unbearable sight. Amanda's body was lying limp on her bed. When he went to touch her, she was ice cold, and he knew that his nightmare had come true. He then covered her and, still in a state of shock, dialed 911. Within minutes, paramedics from the fire department arrived at the scene, but their life-saving gear was useless. Amanda was, indeed, gone. Jason Dillon from the Rock Hill Fire Department asked Billy what he thought had happened, and Billy told him that he thought she may have choked on her blanket as she had a history of rolling in her sleep. Detectives arrived soon after and secured the house as an active crime scene and began an investigation. The detectives were immediately suspicious of Billy's reaction to his daughter's death. His calm demeanor seemed unnatural, and he did not display much emotion at all. Soon, dozens of investigators filled the tiny house looking for clues, but the house was a mess, with the family's belongings cluttering every room. There were clothes piled on every surface, dishes overflowing out of the sinks, cockroaches scurrying into the corners. In the midst of this, Amanda's body lay fully clothed on her bed, surrounded by her books and recent school pictures that she'd just gotten back from the photographer. When the body was examined, investigators found that she'd been beaten and strangled to death after being assaulted. There were bruises on her body, and physical evidence was found on her clothes. The evidence was collected in the hopes that it could be used in identifying the killer. While processing the house for clues, police found another oddity. After examining all the doors and the windows, they realized that there were no signs of forced entry into the home. All the entrances were locked from the inside. This indicated to investigators that the killer likely came from within the house. The detectives spoke to Billy and asked him how he thought Amanda had died. Billy claimed that she may have been strangled by her blanket in her sleep, which was not in line with the evidence at the crime scene. Detectives knew they needed to dig deeper. Upon looking into his background, they learned that 2 years prior, he and his wife had both pleaded guilty to neglecting the proper care of their children. This was the final piece of information that they needed. Along with his emotionless reaction to her death, his bizarre explanation of how she died, and the fact that there were no signs of forced entry into the house, it seemed to the police that Billy was clearly the prime suspect in their case. They immediately took him downtown to the police station for more intense questioning. Over the next few days, detectives grilled Billy mercilessly. He faced over 17 hours of interrogation over the next 4 days. On the first day of interrogation, the 29th of November 2001, the same day of the murder, Billy was questioned for 3.5 hours by detectives. As a result of this initial questioning, detectives had no doubt that he had committed the terrible crime. All they needed from him was a confession. But on that first day, Billy insisted that he was innocent again and again, over 650 times according to the recordings of the interrogations. He told the police that he loved his daughters and there was no way he would have ever hurt Amanda. He claimed that the only reason he didn't hear anything that night was because the machine he used for sleep apnea was very loud and it drowned out any outside noise. This seemed unlikely to the investigators, who continued to probe Billy to see if they could get a confession out of him. However, Billy would not admit to the crime. They tried to use his faith against him, saying he'd burn in hell for what he did. They also tried to tell him once the physical evidence they had collected came back as a match to him, he'd have nowhere to hide. Yet, no matter what they said, Billy continued to deny any involvement in the murder of his daughter. Finally, as they entered the 4th hour of questioning on the second day, Billy asked for a polygraph or lie detector test, believing it would be what finally convinced them of his innocence. Unfortunately, this would be where it all began to unravel for Billy. Not long after beginning his polygraph, the individual conducting the test slammed his hand down on the table and told the detectives that they had enough to end the test. He looked Billy in the eye and told him he'd failed the test. Billy was devastated. Following these results, detectives pressed Billy further, wanting to know why he'd done this terrible thing to his daughter. Slowly, Billy began to talk. Billy eventually confessed, yet he seemed unsure of his own statements. The first confession ended with him signing a written statement of what he'd done, admitting to killing his own daughter. But that would not be all. By the end of the 4th day of the interrogation, Billy had given a total of 4 different confessions to the police, and none of them matched each other or aligned with the evidence at the crime scene. In one, Amanda was beaten with a broom, but this was not mentioned in any of his other confessions. Some confessions included a dream, yet in other statements, the dream was excluded, or a very different version of the dream was told. None of the details from each individual confession lined up with one another. Regardless of this, detectives accepted them as the truth, even though they believed Billy to be severely mentally disturbed. The 4th and final confession was a video reenactment, where the police took him back to his house and taped him as he went over what he did the night of the murder. Eventually, due to his many confessions, Billy was charged as the sole perpetrator in the murder of his daughter. However, after these long interrogations, Billy retracted all of his confessions and again protested his innocence in court. Nonetheless, the damage was done, and Billy was sent to prison with no bond or any form of bail. It seemed like the case was done and dusted. A year had passed since the murder. Billy had confessed to the crime, and many people, even those who knew him, were now convinced that he was indeed guilty. But Billy himself was now once again professing his innocence. Phil Beatty, a private attorney from Rock Hill, was now charged to fight this case in court for him. Phil admits that the first time he met Billy, he thought he was guilty. His strategy for the case was to try and get Billy the best plea deal possible and just put the case to rest. However, after speaking to Billy about the process of his interrogation in the initial days after the murder, Beatty was disturbed by what he'd heard. When his court-assigned public defender, B.J. Barrowclough, had arrived at the police station, the police did not allow him to the interrogation room to see Billy, a clear violation of his rights. They produced a note that Billy had allegedly signed, which stated that he did not want to see his attorney at that time. When Barrowclough argued that they could have coerced him into signing this note, they simply refused to let him ask his client himself. It was only after this 4th confession that his defense attorney, B.J. Barrowclough, was allowed to see him. When he asked Billy why he'd signed the confession, Billy replied that the police had told him he'd get the death penalty if he didn't sign it. Beatty was shocked at the clear violation of Billy's rights. However, since the confessions had been written and signed, he was unsure if this information would aid in his case. In an unexpected turn of events, in late 2002, Beatty got a call from the prosecutor's office asking for a meeting. Believing this was in regards to a deal for his client, he agreed to meet with them, but he could never have expected what they were about to tell him. As they sat him down, they explained to him that the DNA found on Amanda's body had finally been processed, and, to the surprise of everyone, the DNA was not Billy's. Beatty was shocked, but also happy to hear this news, because it now meant that his client was innocent and he had a real chance to win this case. But what they would tell him next would shock him even more. He was told that the police had been aware within a few weeks of the murder that the DNA was not a match to Billy, but had kept this information to themselves for over a year. This infuriated Beatty to no end. He could not believe such a grievous miscarriage of justice had been carried out, and that no one had thought this information was important enough to inform Billy's lawyers about it before this time. But then he stopped and asked why they decided to tell him this information now, after all these months, if they'd known it was not Billy's DNA all that time ago. And that is when the final piece of information was revealed to him. He was told that the reason he was being told all of this now was that the police had found a match to the DNA in the system, and they knew whose it was. It belonged to a man named James Sanders. There's not much information known about James Sanders' past, where he came from, or what he was doing prior to 2001. All that's known is he was a career criminal who had committed a variety of crimes prior to this horrific one. He'd been released from prison and moved into the same neighborhood as the Copes only about 2 weeks prior to him killing Amanda. He lived in a house only 2 blocks away from where Billy and his family lived. There's no evidence present that the two men knew each other, and they certainly would have made an unusual pair. Billy Cope was, in the words of his lawyer, a socially isolated 385-pound white man. He was also a devout Christian and aspiring preacher. James Sanders, on the other hand, was an African-American career criminal and drug addict who'd recently gotten out of prison. In the 6 weeks following Amanda's murder in November 2001, Sanders committed or attempted to commit 4 more sexual assaults in the neighborhood. Now that his attorneys knew there was another man whose DNA had been found at the scene of the crime, they realized that Billy was factually innocent. They then questioned him seriously as to why he had provided false confessions to the police when he was interrogated right after the murder occurred. Billy told his lawyers that when he was questioned by the police in the hours following the murder, he had been sure of his innocence. But he'd also been in a state of shock, having just lost his daughter in such a traumatic manner. Due to this, he may have appeared emotionless to them. He also told them that he'd provided false confessions in an effort to confuse the police. He believed that his confessions would not carry any weight unless police were able to prove them, and he didn't believe the evidence would point to any of his confessions being legitimate. However, in this matter, he was wrong, as the police were willing to accept his confessions, even though none of them matched each other, or indeed the evidence found at the scene. Despite Sanders being identified as being present the night that Amanda was killed, Billy was still charged with the crime. The case went to trial in 2004, and the trial was centered around both sides trying to prove what actually had taken place the night of the murder. While Billy's lawyers argued that Billy was not involved in his daughter's death in any manner, the prosecutors found a simple explanation for both Billy's confessions and the new DNA evidence that had been found. They said that the only logical explanation was that both men were in on it and had carried out the crime together. The prosecutors alleged that this is why there were no signs of forced entry into the house, as Billy had let Sanders in and then locked up again once he'd left. Cope's attorneys said prosecutors were just trying to present the evidence in this manner so they could cover up their inappropriate interrogation tactics. They argued that Cope had mental issues and was so devastated by his daughter's death that detectives were able to manipulate him into confessing to a crime he did not commit. The defense was also not allowed to present crucial evidence to the jury due to Judge John C. Hayes III not allowing it on the grounds of it leading the jury to a logical fallacy. The evidence that was excluded was the fact that in the 4 sexual assaults that Sanders had committed or attempted in the weeks following Amanda's murder, there was never any sign of forced entry. It certainly appears that Sanders was a master at breaking and entering and left no evidence for even the most seasoned of detectives to find. Another key piece of evidence the defense lawyers were not allowed to present to the jury was the testimony from a jailhouse informant who claimed he had overheard Sanders say he had raped and killed a little girl in Rock Hill. These sorts of testimonies are often allowed by courts when they help prosecutors, but in this case, when it could have helped the defendant, it was not allowed. While it may seem clear to you that Billy was not involved in his daughter's death at all, this is not how the jury ended up seeing it. Both Sanders and Billy were convicted and were charged with conspiracy, which means they collaborated with each other to commit the crime. They were each given life sentences without the chance of parole in 2004. In April 2009, the verdict was appealed, and a 3-judge panel from the South Carolina Court of Appeals reversed the conspiracy conviction, ruling that there was no evidence that Cope and Sanders knew each other. However, the South Carolina Attorney General appealed this decision soon after, and the decision was overturned. In 2013, the state Supreme Court upheld Cope's conviction, and the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his case. Despite all the evidence seemingly pointing towards Billy's innocence, he remained behind bars. On February 9, 2017, at the age of 53, Billy Cope died of natural causes in state custody. He never got to see the outside of a jail cell after being charged with the murder of his own daughter. Whether or not he was actually guilty, we leave for you to decide. And there we have it, folks. The tragic tale of the murder of Amanda Cope and the nightmare ordeal that followed for her father, Billy. What do you think of the case? Do you think Billy was innocent or guilty? More importantly, was justice served for Amanda Cope? Let us know your opinions in the comments down below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, stay safe and thanks for watching.